There is a city that has carried the weight of the world on its stones for thousands of years. A city where prophets have wept in its streets, where kings have built their thrones upon its hills, where the smoke of ancient offerings once curled upward into a sky that felt close enough to touch. Jerusalem. Even the name carries something, a gravity, a sense that when you speak it, you are touching something older than memory itself. Tonight, we return to that city. We return to a particular afternoon during a particular feast, when the streets were thick with pilgrims and the air smelled of dust and lamb, and the faint sweetness of cedar wood. We return to a story that begins not in a palace, not in a place of power, but beside a pool of still water, surrounded by the people the world had given up on. This is the story of a man who waited 38 years. It is the story of a question that cut through every excuse he had ever prepared, and it is the story of 3 words spoken to a body that had forgotten how to obey. Let us go there now. Let us walk the old stones of Jerusalem together in the fading warmth of a festival afternoon and find the pool called Bethesda and the man who had made it his entire world. The great feasts of Israel were unlike anything in the ancient world. Scholars and historians have tried for centuries to capture in language what it meant for the Jewish people to converge upon Jerusalem at appointed times. The Feast of Passover, the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Weeks. These were not merely religious observances in the modern sense of the word. They were national migrations. They were communal acts of memory. When the feast days approached, families who had lived scattered across Judea, Galilee, the Decapolis, and the regions beyond would pack what they could carry and begin walking. Some came from days away. Some had travelled their entire lives to stand inside the temple courts at least once before they died. The roads leading to Jerusalem during festival season would be thick with caravans, with laughter, with the sound of children running ahead of their parents through the dust, with the low conversation of old men who had made this walk before and knew every stone along the way. The city itself transformed during the feasts. The population swelled beyond what its walls were built to hold. Every courtyard became a guest chamber, every rooftop hosted sleeping travellers beneath the open stars. The markets ran from before dawn until the last lamp burned out. The temple, that enormous gleaming complex of white stone and gold leaf that sat upon the elevated platform of Mount Moriah, became the centre of everything. The sound of the shofar echoed across the surrounding hills. The smell of sacrifice drifted over the city like something ancient and unrelenting. And yet, within that vast and beautiful complexity, there were corners of Jerusalem that the festival season did not transform into something bright. There were places where the joy of the gathered crowds did not quite reach. Places where the sick and the abandoned waited in a silence that the trumpet blast could not fill. One of those places was just inside the city walls, near what was known as the Sheep Gate, the gate through which animals were brought into the city for use in temple sacrifices. It was not a glamorous location. The northern edge of the Temple Mount was a place of practical business, of commerce, of the daily grinding work of religious obligation. And near this gate there was a pool with 5 covered colonnades, 5 roofed porches that stretched around its edges, providing shade and shelter from the sun and the occasional rain. The pool was called Bethesda, which in Aramaic carried meaning that felt almost too perfect for the place. Some scholars translate it as House of Mercy, others as House of Outpouring. Either translation fits. Because what gathered beneath those 5 porticos was a population that had come in search of exactly those things. Mercy, an outpouring. Something from somewhere that could do what no physician, no family member, no amount of praying alone at night had managed to accomplish. Beneath the covered colonnades of Bethesda lay the blind, their eyes sealed shut by cataracts or disease, or the accidents of a world that did not always protect the fragile. They sat with their hands open in their laps, navigating the world entirely by sound, the slap of sandals on the wet stone, the conversation of strangers, the distant trumpet calls from the temple that told them what hour of the day it was. There were the lame, people whose legs had failed them through injury or illness, or the slow collapse of bones that had simply decided they would carry the weight no further. Some had crutches fashioned from branches, some had learned to drag themselves along the stone floors with their arms. Some were carried by family members who came each morning and returned each evening and had organised their entire lives around the logistics of that journey. And there were those the ancient text described simply as paralysed, people for whom whole sections of their bodies had gone silent, unresponsive, as though the connection between thought and motion had simply been cut and no one had found a way to restore it. They waited beneath those 5 porticos because of a belief, a tradition, perhaps ancient, perhaps newer than it sounded, but deeply held, that on certain unpredictable occasions an angel would descend and stir the waters of the pool, and when the waters moved, the first person who managed to enter the pool would be healed, whatever their affliction was. Whatever had brought them to this place of last resort, it would be undone by those stirred waters. Think about what that means. Think about what that tradition did to the people gathered there. It created a community organised entirely around a moment of uncertain timing. No one knew when the waters would move. No one could predict which morning or which afternoon the surface of that pool would suddenly begin to ripple from somewhere beneath. So they stayed. They waited. Day after day, season after season, some of them for years, always watching the surface of the water, always listening for the murmur that would signal it was happening, always bracing to move as fast as their broken bodies could manage toward the edge. And therein lay the particular cruelty of the arrangement for so many of them. The healing, if it came, went to the first person who reached the water. The sick competed against each other. The man with no use of his legs watched men who were merely blind scramble past him. The woman whose paralysis allowed her to move one arm watched others drag themselves forward on 2. The race to healing was rigged against the most severely afflicted. The ones who needed the water most were, by the nature of their need, the least likely to reach it first. It was a place of extraordinary hope and extraordinary heartbreak, existing in the same square footage of stone and water and shade. A place where mercy was promised, but access to it was governed by a rule that rewarded the least sick, where the presence of healing made the waiting more acute, not less. Because at Bethesda, you were never simply in despair. You were always in despair while hope was just across the courtyard, shimmering on the surface of that pool. Among the many bodies lying beneath those covered colonnades, there was one man. The Gospel of John does not give us his name, and this omission feels significant, not careless, but intentional. He is not named because he is, in some sense, meant to stand for something larger than a single biography. He is the man, the one whose story the text has chosen to follow through this particular afternoon. And the detail that John's Gospel offers about him first is not the nature of his condition, but its duration. He had been ill for 38 years. 38 years. Say that slowly. Let it rest in the mind for a moment. 38 years is not a stretch of time that fits neatly into the imagination. It is the length of a career. It is the span from birth to the edge of middle age. It is long enough to watch children grow into adults, to watch parents grow old and die, to watch fashions change and political regimes shift, and the faces in the marketplace turn over entirely. Twice, perhaps 3 times. 38 years is long enough that the life you were living before the affliction began starts to feel like something that happened to a different person. The memory of walking, of moving without effort, of simply rising from a sleeping mat and standing upright and going wherever your feet chose to take you. After 38 years, that memory has become almost mythological. Something from before the world was this way. We do not know how this man came to be at the Pool of Bethesda. We do not know if he arrived a month after his illness began, full of desperate hope, or if he spent decades searching elsewhere first, and arrived at the pool only when every other option had been exhausted. We do not know if he had family, people who brought him food and water and news of the outside world, or whether he had been abandoned to the routine charity of strangers. We do not know if he had ever been close to healing, had ever felt himself poised at the edge of a stirred pool with a clear path forward, only to be outpaced at the last moment. The text does not tell us these things. What the text tells us is this: he was there. He had been there long enough that Jesus, who had apparently been watching this man, or who knew this man's situation through means the Gospel does not pause to explain, knew about the 38 years. And the text tells us one other thing. Jesus asked him a question before doing anything else. Picture the afternoon, the festival crowds moving through the streets just beyond the walls of this place, the sound of the city drifting in over the colonnades, voices calling out, the distant lowing of animals, the sandaled footsteps of 10,000 pilgrims, and here inside the pool complex the familiar low atmosphere of the chronically ill. People lying on their mats, adjusting their positions against the discomfort of the stone, dozing in the warmth, watching each other with the dull familiarity of long acquaintance. The pool itself sitting in the centre, its surface still and dark in the shade of the afternoon. Jesus moves through this space, John's Gospel tells us with striking matter-of-factness that Jesus saw this man lying there and knew he had been in this condition for a long time. What is remarkable about that sentence is what it implies. There were many people at Bethesda that day, many blind, many lame, many paralysed. The full range of human bodily failure was present beneath those porticos, and Jesus knew this. He saw all of it, but his attention came to rest on this particular man, not because this man was the loudest or the most dramatic in his suffering, or because he had found some way to attract attention. The text gives no indication that this man had singled himself out in any way. Jesus simply saw him, simply turned his attention, in a crowd of suffering, to one face, one body, one 38-year history. There is something here that deserves to be held carefully, because it speaks to something the rest of this story will only deepen. The Pool of Bethesda was a place where healing was structured as a competition, where the measure of who deserved it first was speed, physical capability, proximity to the edge. Jesus enters this space and immediately reverses the logic. He does not go to whoever is closest to the water. He does not seek out the person most likely to reach the pool. He seeks out the one who has been there the longest, the one who has demonstrably, repeatedly, failed to win the race that the pool requires, the one who, by the pool's own rules, should be last. And then he asks the question, do you want to be made well? It is easy, at first glance, to read that question as strange, even slightly cruel. Of course the man wants to be made well. He has been lying beside a healing pool for some portion of 38 years. Why would Jesus need to ask? What is the point of the question? But the more you sit with it, the more the question opens up. Because what Jesus is asking is not quite as simple as whether the man wants his legs to work. He is asking something that cuts beneath the surface of physical desire into something older and murkier, something that long-suffering does to a person's inner architecture, to the way they understand themselves and the world and what is possible within it. 38 years of disability is 38 years of building a life around a limitation, a life in which the limitation is not the exception, but the foundation. You learn, over that span of time, not just how to manage your condition, but how to think of yourself in relation to it. Your identity becomes inseparable from what you cannot do. Your days are structured around what your body will not allow. Your relationships, your expectations, your private interior conversations about the future, all of it is shaped by the fact of the limitation. The limitation is not something that happened to you and then stood apart from you. After 38 years, the limitation is you, in some very real psychological sense. And so when someone appears and asks, not how you are managing, not what you need today, not whether you have eaten, or whether your mat is dry, but do you want to be made well? They are asking something more destabilizing than it sounds. They are asking whether you are prepared for the life that would exist on the other side of what you have always known. Whether you want not just the healing, but everything healing would unmake about the self you have built inside this limitation. There is also the matter of disappointment. 38 years beside a pool that has never moved for you, or if it has moved, has never moved in your direction, has never resulted in you being the one who made it to the edge in time, is 38 years of daily hope followed by daily failure. The kind of repeated disappointment that does not simply accumulate but compounds, each new day adding its weight to the structure of all previous days until the structure becomes something you live inside rather than something you carry. Hope, after that many years, can become genuinely dangerous. To hope again, really hope, the kind of open and unprotected hope that vulnerability requires, is to risk adding one more layer to a structure that is already almost too heavy to bear. Jesus, who appears throughout the Gospels to understand the inner life of the people he encounters, with an accuracy that goes far beyond ordinary perception, asks this question, not because he does not know the answer, but because the answer matters, because the act of saying it, of speaking it aloud, of bringing it up from wherever it has been buried under 38 years of waiting, is itself part of what needs to happen before anything else can. And the man answers, not with a simple yes, not with weeping or desperation or some dramatic declaration of faith. He answers the way someone answers when they have explained this particular situation many times before, and have long since abandoned any expectation that explaining it will change anything. He says, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me." This is a profoundly human answer. It is not an answer to the question that was asked. Jesus asked if he wanted to be made well. The man answers by describing the logistical problem that has prevented him from reaching the water. It is the answer of someone who has spent so much time thinking about the mechanism of potential healing, the pool, the timing, the scramble to the edge, that the deeper question has become almost impossible to hear. It is the answer of someone who has, perhaps, stopped thinking about wellness itself and started thinking only about the race, about whether this time someone will help him, whether this time he will be fast enough. The question of whether he wants to be well has dissolved into the question of how one gets into the pool, but also, and this is important, it is an honest answer. It is not a performance of faith. It is not a dramatic declaration. It is a tired man telling the truth about his situation. The pool has not worked for him, not because of a lack of desire, but because of a lack of help. Someone always gets there first. He is not bitter, exactly. He's simply describing what has been true every day for as long as he can remember. And it is to this tired, honest, logistically focused man that Jesus speaks the words that change everything. There are moments in Scripture that require very little ornamentation to be felt. Moments where the text is so clean, so spare, so precisely arranged that the addition of anything would only dilute what is already there. This is one of those moments. Jesus does not offer a lengthy discourse. He does not explain what he is about to do or why. He does not ask the man to describe his faith or recount his prayer history, or demonstrate his worthiness in any way. He speaks 3 words, or in the Greek of John's Gospel, the imperative is a single sentence with 3 distinct commands, and they are simply this: get up, pick up your mat, walk. There is no conditional language here. No if you believe, or if you are worthy, or if the pool's waters are right. There is only the command, the statement of what is now required, spoken as though the body has already caught up with the instruction. Get up, which presumes that getting up is now possible. Pick up your mat, which presumes not only that he can stand, but that he can bend, can grasp, can lift, that the full range of ordinary human motion has been restored. Walk, the simplest and most extraordinary of the 3, walk, as though he has simply been sitting still for a moment, and has now been reminded to move on. And the man does. The text says it with the same spare elegance as the command itself. Immediately the man was made well, and he took up his mat and walked. Immediately. Not after a moment of trembling, not after a gradual return of sensation, a slow rebuilding of strength, a tentative first attempt followed by collapse, followed by another attempt. Immediately. The 38 years ended in a single breath. Whatever had held his body in that state of paralysis, whatever disruption to nerve or muscle or bone or all 3 had kept him lying on that mat beside that pool through decade after decade, it was gone. Simply gone. Replaced by a wholeness that was in one sense entirely new to this man, and in another sense the most ancient and natural thing about him, the ordinary functioning of a human body moving through the world as it was meant to move. Picture what happens in that body in the moments after the command is spoken. Sensation returning to limbs that have been silent for decades. Not pain exactly, but the sudden overwhelming awareness of having limbs, having legs, having feet, having the whole complex living architecture of a body that works. The feeling of the stone floor under those feet as he stands, really stands, full weight, full balance, the automatic adjustments of muscles and tendons and the inner ear that allow a standing person to remain upright without thinking about it. The man has not thought about any of these things in 38 years, because he has not needed to, and now, suddenly, all of it is operating. Not as something remarkable, not as something he has to concentrate on maintaining, but simply as the baseline condition of being alive in a body that functions. He bends down and rolls up his mat. That gesture alone, bending, reaching, grasping, standing again, contains 38 years of impossibility made suddenly ordinary. And then he walks, out from under the portico, past the other people lying on their mats, past the pool whose waters never stirred for him, past the columns of stone that had framed his existence for what might have been years, and out into whatever comes next. The text of John's Gospel tells us something else about that day, and it is the kind of detail that would almost be funny if it were not so revealing of human nature. It was the Sabbath, the 7th day, the day of rest commanded in the book of Genesis, and elaborated through centuries of rabbinic tradition into an extraordinarily detailed system of prohibitions and permissions. By the time of Jesus, The oral tradition around Sabbath observance had grown into a complex and carefully maintained structure. The rabbis had identified 39 categories of forbidden labour, and carrying objects from one domain to another was among them. Carrying a burden on the Sabbath, it was prohibited, and a sleeping mat, the mat the man had just rolled up and tucked under his arm, the mat he was now carrying through the streets of Jerusalem, a mat qualified as a burden. So when the religious authorities encountered this man walking with his mat, their first question was not about him, not about how he was, not about the extraordinary thing that had happened to a body that had not worked for 38 years, not about the nature of the healing or who had performed it or what it meant. Their first question was about the mat. "It is the Sabbath," they told him. "It is not lawful for you to carry your mat." The man's response is simple and direct. He says, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" He is not arguing theology. He is stating the chain of causation as he experienced it. Someone healed me. That same someone told me to carry my mat. I carried it. He is not trying to pick a fight about religious law. He is not, at this moment, even thinking about religious law. He's a man who walked out of 38 years of paralysis an hour ago. The categories of his mind are still trying to catch up with the reality of his body. But the authorities are not satisfied. They want to know who told him to do this. Who is responsible? The text says the healed man did not know who it was, that Jesus had withdrawn into the crowd that filled the area. In the chaos of a festival day, in a city full of pilgrims, Jesus had simply become one face among thousands. Think about that. The man who had just been healed of a 38-year affliction could not have pointed to his healer and said, "That is him. That is the man." He had been lying on his mat. He had heard a voice, received a command, felt his body respond, and then, presumably, he had been so absorbed in the process of standing and rolling his mat and walking for the first time in decades that by the time he looked up, the crowd had closed around whoever had spoken to him. He did not even know the name. This will matter, because later Jesus finds him again. The temple courts were the heart of Jerusalem during the feast days. The enormous platform of the Temple Mount, an engineering achievement that remains astonishing even by modern standards, a massive artificial platform constructed to elevate the temple complex above the surrounding city, was filled during the feast with worshippers, with teachers and their students, with merchants operating in the outer courts, with the ceaseless movement of a people engaged in the great annual act of appearing before their God. It was into this space that the healed man eventually came, perhaps to give thanks, perhaps simply because the temple was where a Jewish man went on a feast day, and he was, for the first time in 38 years, a man who could walk to the temple under his own power, and there Jesus found him. The text does not tell us how. In a crowd of thousands, on the most active day of the religious calendar, Jesus located this man in the temple courts, and when he found him, he spoke to him again. And what he said this second time is almost as striking as what he said the first time. "See, you have been made well. Sin no more, so that nothing worse may happen to you." This is a statement that has generated considerable theological discussion over the centuries, because it touches on the ancient and often debated question of the relationship between sin and suffering. The disciples of Jesus, earlier in John's Gospel, will ask him point blank about a man born blind. "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" The assumption embedded in that question, that suffering is a consequence of sin, that physical affliction tracks moral failure, was not an obscure fringe belief. It was a common framework for understanding why bad things happen to people, a framework with deep roots in certain interpretations of the Hebrew scriptures and in the surrounding culture. If you suffered, something had gone wrong morally. Either you had sinned, or someone close to you had. Suffering was, in this view, a kind of ledger entry, evidence that some account somewhere had gone into debt. Jesus, in the case of the blind man, will explicitly reject this framework. He tells the disciples that neither the man nor his parents sinned, that the man was born blind so that the works of God might be revealed in him. The suffering was not the consequence of sin. It was the context for something else entirely. But here at the temple, Jesus says something different. He says, "Sin no more, so that nothing worse may happen to you." He does not say that the 38-year illness was caused by sin. He does not make that causal claim. What he says is forward-looking. It is a warning, a pastoral instruction, a word of concern for what comes next. Whatever the man's history, Whatever the relationship between the life he had lived and the condition that had kept him beside that pool, Jesus is not here to prosecute the past. He is here to speak to the future. You have been made well. Now live in accordance with that wholeness. Protect what has been given to you. It is the word of someone who takes seriously both the gift that has just been given and the person who has received it. It is not a threat. It is not a conditional. Your healing will be revoked if you sin. It is a charge. A recognition that the healed man now has a future he did not have this morning, and that the question of how he inhabits that future matters. The healed man, upon learning the name of his healer, upon learning that it was Jesus who had spoken to him at the pool, Jesus who had told him to get up and walk, goes to the religious authorities and tells them. The text reports this without editorial comment. We do not know the man's motivation. Was he grateful and thought they should know? Was he afraid of the authorities and tried to deflect their suspicion by naming the one responsible? Did he not fully understand the implications of what he was saying? Did not realize that naming Jesus to the religious leadership of Jerusalem was not a neutral act? The text does not say. It simply says he told them it was Jesus who had made him well. And the authorities, for their part, used this information not as an occasion for wonder, but as an occasion for opposition. This is the moment in John's Gospel where the conflict between Jesus and the religious establishment of Jerusalem hardens from friction into something more determined. The text says that the Jewish leaders began persecuting Jesus because he had done this on the Sabbath. And when Jesus, confronted with their opposition, speaks about his relationship with God, about the Son doing what the Father does, about the Father having given all judgment to the Son, the opposition sharpens further. They wanted to kill him, the text says, because he was not only breaking the Sabbath but was also calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. A healing, a single act of restoration beside a pool of still water, a man who had not walked in 38 years, walking. And within hours the news of it has travelled through the city and landed in the laps of men who have decided that the most important thing about this event is that it happened on the wrong day, that the mat the man carried was a violation, that the one who healed him had stepped outside the boundaries of what the law permitted, that the correct response to the extraordinary is not wonder but interrogation, and the correct conclusion is not gratitude but prosecution. This is not unique to the first century. It is perhaps the most consistent and depressing feature of institutional religious life in every era. The tendency of systems built to protect the sacred to become, over time, better at protecting themselves than at protecting the sacred. The rules that were meant to honour God become, by degrees, rules that honour the rule-keeping. The traditions that were meant to create space for the holy become, by degrees, traditions that crowd it out. The Sabbath was given to Israel as a gift, as a weekly reminder that human beings are not defined by their labour, that rest is holy, that the rhythm of creation includes cessation. And somehow, by the time Jesus walked through the Pool of Bethesda, the gift had become a fence, and the fence had become a wall, and on one particular afternoon a man stood up from a 38-year paralysis and carried his mat through the streets of Jerusalem, and the wall was offended. Let us stay for a moment with the question that Jesus asked, because it is worth asking again, here, in the quietness of this evening, in whatever room you are in right now, with whatever you have been carrying. Do you want to be made well? It is a question that sounds simple, and is not. It is a question that assumes that the person being asked has a genuine say in the matter. That wellness is not just something that happens to you or fails to happen to you, but something that requires a kind of interior consent, a willingness to participate, a readiness to receive what healing would require of you, and what it would cost you, and what it would change. The man at Bethesda had, in some sense, organised his entire life around the idea of getting into the pool. The pool was his answer. The pool was where healing lived. And when Jesus appeared, he did not bring the pool. He brought something that had nothing to do with the pool. He bypassed the entire system the man had been waiting in for decades and spoke directly to the condition itself. Get up. Pick up your mat. Walk. This is worth noticing. The man's answer to Jesus had been entirely about the pool, about the logistics of accessing the healing that the pool represented, and Jesus did not argue with him about the pool, did not say the pool is the wrong answer, did not dismiss the tradition or the belief or the years the man had invested in that particular form of hope. He simply ignored the pool, went around it, spoke to the body directly, as though the body had been waiting for exactly this kind of speech, specific, clear, confident, expecting a response. How many of us have spent years of our lives focused on a particular pool, on one specific source from which we have decided that what we need most must come, and have found ourselves season after season unable to get there in time, watching others reach it first, explaining to anyone who will listen the logistical problem that keeps us from the edge of the water. The pool is not always a physical place. Sometimes the pool is a relationship we think will finally make us whole. Sometimes it is a professional achievement. Sometimes it is a particular financial threshold. Sometimes it is the approval of someone whose approval we have spent years trying to earn. The pool is wherever we have decided that the thing we need most is located, and to which we have turned our lives into a waiting room. And the question Jesus asks is, do you want to be made well? Not do you want to get to the pool? Do you want to be made well? It is a question about the destination, not the route. A question about what lies on the other side of all the waiting. And implicit in the question is a possibility that the pool cannot offer, that healing might be available through a means that has nothing to do with the logistics of your particular situation, that it might come not from the water being stirred at the right moment when you happen to be close enough, but from a voice speaking to what is broken in you directly, without waiting for any conditions to be met. There is something else in this story that tends to be overlooked, and it is the matter of what Jesus asked the man to do in order to be healed. He asked him to do the very thing that his illness prevented him from doing: get up. This is not possible for a paralyzed man. The paralysis is precisely the inability to get up. To command a paralyzed man to get up is to ask for the impossible, or at least it would be if the command were coming from any other source. Jesus tells a man who cannot stand to stand. He tells a man who cannot lift to lift. He tells a man who cannot walk to walk. The commands are not instructions for how to access healing. They are instructions that the healing makes possible. And the only way to know if the healing has occurred is to attempt the commands before certainty is available. This is the structure of faith as it appears throughout the Gospels, and it is not a comfortable structure. It does not say, first believe fully, then act. It says, act in the direction of what you have been promised, and discover in the acting whether the promise holds. The man could not have known, before he tried to get up, that his legs would support him. He had to try first. He had to commit, at least fractionally, to the motion, to shift his weight in the direction of standing, to engage muscles that had been silent for 38 years, and in that moment of attempted obedience the healing met him. This is a pattern that appears again and again in the miracle stories of the New Testament. The 10 lepers are told to go and show themselves to the priests, the act required of a cleansed person. And as they go, before they have arrived, they are cleansed. The disciples are told to launch their boats and let down their nets after a night of catching nothing, and the choice to obey, despite the absurdity of the instruction, is what precedes the catch. The blind man in John 9 is told to go wash in the Pool of Siloam, a walk he has to make blind, and he goes, and he washes, and he comes back seeing. In each case, the faith that is asked for is not a feeling. It is not an emotion. It is not even a cognitive certainty. It is a motion, a willingness to move in the direction of the promised thing as though it is already there before you can see it. For the man at Bethesda, that motion was the attempt to stand, and the attempt was answered. 38 years is a long time. It is long enough to make the waiting feel like the whole story. Long enough that the world outside the colonnade of Bethesda might have faded into something almost theoretical. A place that exists in memory, and in the conversation of visitors, but that the man himself had stopped expecting to inhabit again. Long enough that the question of whether he would ever walk freely through the streets of Jerusalem, feel the uneven stones under his own 2 feet, choose a direction and simply go there, that question had probably at some point stopped feeling like a question. It had settled into something more like an answer, the answer being no, the answer being not for me, the answer being this is what my life is, and I have learned to live within it as best I can. And yet, on one particular festival afternoon, in a city full of 10,000 pilgrims, in a pool complex full of people who had all also been told by the shape of their lives that the answer was no, a man turned his attention to the one who had been waiting longest, the one who was, by the pool's own logic, the least likely to succeed, the one whose answer of no had been accumulating the longest, and he asked him a question, and the man answered honestly, and 3 words changed everything. There is no dramatic prayer recorded in this story, no long intercession, no laying on of hands, no elaborate ritual, no ceremony of any kind, just 3 words, spoken with the confidence of someone who knows exactly what they are saying and is not uncertain about the outcome, and immediately the man was well. Immediately. It is a word that the Gospels use with some frequency when describing what happens when Jesus speaks to a condition. Not eventually, not gradually, not after a period of rehabilitation. Immediately. The 38 years responded to 3 words the way the morning responds to the rising of the sun, not as something that has to be argued into happening, but as something that was always going to happen once the right thing arrived. Let us think about the moment the man walked out of the pool complex and into the streets of Jerusalem. The first steps, the first turns onto unfamiliar streets, or streets that had been familiar once, 38 years ago, that now had to be relearned by a body that was doing something it had not done in decades. The first time he felt himself moving with the crowd instead of being left behind by it. The first time he made a choice, left or right, this street or that one, purely because he wanted to, without the choice being constrained by what his body could or could not manage. What do you do with yourself when the constraint you have organised your life around is suddenly gone? When the absence that has shaped your identity, your relationships, your daily rhythm, your interior landscape, when that absence is filled, there is joy in it, certainly. But there is also perhaps something more complicated, the need to reconstruct a self that is no longer defined by what it cannot do, the need to discover what it wants, now that want is no longer academic, the need to learn, for the first time or for the first time in a very long time, who you are when you're not defined by your limitation. The man at Bethesda does not give us much to work with here. He goes to the temple, that much we know, and in the temple Jesus finds him and speaks to him a second time, and after that, the text lets him go. We do not know what the rest of his life looked like. We do not know if he became a follower of Jesus or remained at a distance. We do not know if he told his story for the rest of his life, or if he eventually stopped talking about it, the way people sometimes stop talking about the most important things that have happened to them because words have ceased to be adequate. We do not know if he ever went back to Bethesda, if he ever stood at the edge of that pool and looked into the still water and tried to understand what his life had been and what it now was. What we know is this. He walked out of that place carrying his mat, and he never laid it down there again. The feast continued. The city continued. The thousands of pilgrims moved through the streets of Jerusalem, buying and selling and praying and arguing and eating and doing all the ordinary things that people do, even in holy cities on holy days. The Temple Mount rose above it all, white and gold in the afternoon light, its enormous platform visible from miles away. The priests moved through their duties. The teachers taught in the courts. The shofar called out its notes at the appointed hours, and somewhere in that city a man walked who had not walked that morning. Walked with the slightly uncertain gait of someone rediscovering something. Not hesitant exactly, but attended to. Conscious of each step in a way that a person who has walked their whole life is not. Each step still somewhat extraordinary to the person taking it, even as it looked, to anyone watching, like exactly the ordinary motion it was. A man walking through a city. Nothing remarkable about it at all if you did not know. And the controversy the healing had generated moved on its own trajectory through the corridors of religious authority. Meetings, consultations, the slow accumulation of grievance against a name. Jesus, who healed on the Sabbath, who called God his Father, who moved through the crowd and spoke 3 words to a paralyzed man, and then disappeared before anyone could properly register what had happened. These 2 trajectories, the healed man walking freely through Jerusalem, the authorities hardening toward his healer, existed simultaneously, on the same afternoon, in the same city, under the same festival sky, the miracle and the politics of the miracle running parallel, not touching, each following its own logic toward its own conclusion. This is, in miniature, the shape of the entire story that John's Gospel is telling. The light enters the world and illuminates some things and casts shadows in others. The healing happens and produces gratitude in one quarter and opposition in another. The words of life are spoken, and some who hear them are freed, and others are frightened, and others are simply enraged. The pool at Bethesda was a place where hope and despair existed side by side. The story of what happened there is a place where restoration and resistance exist side by side. It is not a clean story. It is not a story that resolves neatly into universal goodwill and collective celebration. It is a story about what happens when the extraordinary arrives in the middle of the ordinary, and different people, encountering the same event, choose entirely different things to do with it. As this night settles in and the day's noise fades to silence around you, hold this image for a moment. The Pool of Bethesda, 5 colonnades casting their shade over the stone, the water still and dark in the late afternoon, the people lying on their mats, each one a world of waiting, of hope that has learned to be careful with itself, of bodies that have not done what they were built to do in a very long time, and one man among them who has been there the longest, who has the least reason to expect that today will be different from all the previous days, who, when asked if he wants to be made well, does not answer with a yes but with an explanation of everything that has prevented it, who is not by any measure the most promising candidate for a miracle, who has no particular faith on display, no practiced piety, no dramatic declaration, just a tired man giving an honest answer about why the pool has never worked for him, and 3 words: get up, pick up your mat, walk, and immediately he was made well. Whatever you are waiting beside tonight, whatever your version of the pool is, whatever the 38-year thing in your life looks like, the story of Bethesda does not promise you a timeline. It does not promise that the waiting will end tomorrow, or that the pool you have been watching will finally stir for you. What it does offer is something perhaps more unsettling and more hopeful than that. The possibility that what you need is not at the pool at all, that it might arrive from a direction you are not watching, that it might speak to your condition directly, without waiting for any of the circumstances to cooperate, that the question you might be asked before it happens is not whether you have enough faith, or whether you have been patient enough, or whether you have earned it, but simply whether you want it, whether you're ready to get up, whether you're willing to carry your mat into a life you do not yet know how to navigate, and that on some ordinary afternoon, in a city full of noise and crowds and all the usual complexity of being alive, the one who sees individuals even in the midst of many will find the one who has been waiting longest, will stop, will ask the question, and will speak 3 words that the body, against all the evidence of all the years, will know exactly how to answer. Rest now. Let the quietness of the evening hold you. Somewhere across the long history of this world, a man rolled up a mat he had not needed to carry for 38 years, and walked out into the Jerusalem afternoon, and everything was different. Let that be the last thought your mind carries into sleep tonight. Everything was different. And immediately. Good night. There is one more thing worth considering before we let the story fully rest, and it has to do with the nature of the crowd at Bethesda, not the individual man, but the collective, the many dozens, perhaps hundreds of people gathered beneath those 5 colonnades on the day Jesus walked through. People who were also blind, also lame, also paralyzed. People who had also been waiting, some of them for years. People who had also organized their lives around the possibility of the pool, and for whom, on that particular afternoon, nothing changed. No one else was healed. No other name was called. No other command was spoken to any other body in that place. This is one of the more quietly troubling aspects of the story, and it would be dishonest to glide past it without acknowledgement. It raises the question that suffering people have always raised when they encounter a story about healing. Why him? Why that one? What made this particular man the one whose waiting ended that afternoon when the waiting of all the others continued? Was it something about the depth of his suffering? He had been there 38 years, but perhaps someone else had been there 40. Was it something about his faith? His answer to Jesus' question was not a declaration of faith, but an inventory of obstacles. He did not say, "I believe you can heal me." He said, "I cannot get to the pool in time." Was it something about his character? We're given nothing to suggest it. The text does not answer this. John's Gospel, in its characteristic way, simply does not go there. It tells us about the man who was healed and does not stop to address the ones who are not. This silence has been felt by readers across 2,000 years, particularly by readers who have sat beside their own versions of the pool and not been called, who have watched others receive what they were also waiting for, who have knelt in the same faith and spoken the same prayers and received, for reasons they cannot fathom, a different answer. What the theologians have offered, across the centuries, is not so much an answer as a reframing. The healing at Bethesda is not presented as a template, not as a guarantee that all who wait long enough will be healed, or that all who answer honestly will be called to stand. It is presented as a sign, a single, specific moment of the particular. This man, this afternoon, this pool, these 3 words, that points towards something larger than itself. Just as a single burning lamp in a dark room is not the source of all light in the world, but is evidence that light exists, and that the darkness is not the final condition of things, so one healing in one corner of Jerusalem on one Sabbath afternoon is not a promise that all the suffering of Bethesda ends today. It is evidence of something. Evidence that the one who moves through the crowd sees individuals. Evidence that long suffering is not invisible. Evidence that 3 words spoken from the right source are enough. This does not dissolve the difficulty. It does not make the silence of the unanswered prayer comfortable to inhabit. But it does suggest that the story of Bethesda is not best read as a transaction. If you wait long enough, if you answer honestly, if the conditions are right, you will be healed. It is better read as a window, a brief clear opening onto something that is always present but not always visible. The attention of the one who created the human body and has not stopped knowing what each one of them needs, even when the pool is still, even when the years accumulate, even when the answer that arrives is not the one that was waited for. This is harder. It requires more of a person than a simple formula would. It asks you to hold both things at once. The reality of the one man who walked out of Bethesda carrying his mat, and the reality of everyone else who did not. To receive the first as genuine and good without using it as evidence that suffering is simply a matter of waiting correctly. To grieve the second without concluding from it that no one is seen, that no attention is paid, that the pool will always be still. Faith in the biblical tradition has rarely been presented as a system that resolves cleanly. It has been presented as a way of moving through a world that contains both healing and continued suffering, both answered prayer and long silence, both the man who stood up and walked, and the men and women who watched him go and remained where they were. It is a way of moving through all of that without collapsing into either easy certainty or permanent despair. The story of Bethesda does not offer easy certainty. What it offers is a specific, embodied, utterly concrete moment in which something that had been broken for 38 years was made whole in an instant. And it offers it not as a proof, but as a gift. To that man, to that afternoon, to everyone who has ever read about it since and recognized something of their own waiting in his. Jerusalem is still there. The city has been destroyed and rebuilt, occupied and liberated, and is today one of the most contested and watched and prayed over pieces of ground on the surface of the earth. The Pool of Bethesda has been excavated by archaeologists and can be visited, or could be, in eras of access, by pilgrims who want to stand in the place where the story happened. The stones are still there beneath the ground. The shape of the pool complex, the 5 colonnades, the layout that matches what John's Gospel describes. It has been confirmed in the earth. The place was real. The pool was real. The 5 porticos cast real shade over real stone on real afternoons in the 1st century of the Common Era. And while we cannot know with archaeological certainty what happened beside that water on one Sabbath afternoon during one of the Jewish feast days, we know that the story of it has travelled through 2,000 years of human history and arrived here, tonight, in whatever room you are in, as something still capable of doing what stories do when they are alive, of making you feel, however briefly, that the distance between then and there and now and here is smaller than it usually seems, that the man on the mat and the listening, waiting part of you are not as far apart as the centuries between you would suggest, that the question, do you want to be made well, is still being asked, in forms you might not immediately recognise, and that the answer still matters, and that 3 words, or their equivalent, in whatever language your particular life speaks, are still sufficient to change what 38 years have established as permanent. The night is quiet now. Your breath is slowing. Whatever you are carrying from this day, whatever weariness or worry or long accumulated weight, let it rest for a while. You have carried it faithfully. You do not have to carry it through the night as well. The pool is still, the city sleeps, and somewhere in the ancient record of human experience, a man stands up from a mat he has lain on for 38 years and discovers that his legs work perfectly. Let that be enough for now. Let that be the image that carries you over the threshold from waking into sleep. Rest well. You are seen. Before we begin tonight's journey through one of the most remarkable stories of courage and wisdom from ancient scripture, I want to take just a moment to connect with you, our community of listeners spread across the world. If you're enjoying this content and finding value in these stories, using your hype points on this video truly helps the channel more than you could possibly know. It is one of the most powerful ways you can support what we do here. And if you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review helps us reach more people who might benefit from these contemplative narratives. We also love hearing from you in the comments. If you feel like sharing, let us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing the global community that gathers here each night. And of course, if you enjoy this content and haven't already, subscribing means you'll never miss a story. Now, let's turn our attention to a tale from ancient Israel, a story that unfolds in the wilderness during one of the most turbulent periods in biblical history. This is not a story of armies clashing or kingdoms falling. Instead, it's something far more profound. A story about how one woman's wisdom prevented a massacre, changed the course of destiny, and revealed that sometimes the greatest victories come not through violence, but through discernment. Imagine a moment when history balances on a knife's edge, when anger threatens to consume reason, when vengeance seems not only justified, but inevitable. And then imagine a single voice, calm, measured, fearless, that changes everything. This is the story of Abigail, a woman whose name deserves to be remembered alongside the great heroes of faith. While warriors are celebrated for their strength and kings for their power, Abigail earned her place in sacred history through something rarer and more precious, the wisdom to see what needed to be done and the courage to do it. Her story takes place during a transitional period in Israel's history, a time of uncertainty and violence, when the old order was dying but the new order had not yet been born. It was an era that tested everyone who lived through it, demanding choices that would echo through generations. Chapter 1. The Wilderness King. The wilderness of Paran stretched endlessly beneath a merciless sun, a landscape of stone and dust where only the hardiest could survive. In this unforgiving terrain, David lived as an outlaw, though destiny had already marked him for something far greater. Years earlier, the prophet Samuel had anointed him in secret, pouring sacred oil over the head of a shepherd boy and declaring him the future king of Israel. But standing between David and that throne was Saul, the current king, whose jealousy had turned to murderous obsession. David had done nothing to deserve this persecution except succeed where Saul had failed, slaying Goliath, winning battles, earning the love of the people. The irony of David's situation was profound and painful. He had been chosen by God, anointed by God's prophet, promised a kingdom and a dynasty. Yet he lived in caves and hid in the wilderness like a criminal. He commanded the loyalty of hundreds of brave men, yet possessed no land to call his own. He was Israel's greatest warrior, yet he spent his days running from Israel's king rather than defending Israel's borders. So David ran. He gathered around him a band of men who had also been cast out by society. Those in debt, those in distress, those discontent with the current order. They numbered in the hundreds, these wilderness warriors, and they survived by their wits and their swords in the barren places where civilization's reach grew thin. These were not simple bandits or raiders, despite what some might have claimed. These were men who had been failed by the current system, who saw in David a leader worth following, who believed that Israel's future lay with this anointed fugitive rather than with the increasingly unstable king who currently sat on the throne. They were soldiers without an army, loyal to a king without a kingdom, living in the tension between what was and what would be. Despite his circumstances, David maintained a code of honor that set him apart from common bandits. When he and his men encountered shepherds tending flocks in the wilderness, they didn't rob them. Instead, they protected them from raiders and wild animals, forming a living wall around the vulnerable. They asked nothing in return, operating on the ancient principle that hospitality and mutual aid were sacred bonds, especially in harsh lands where survival often depended on the kindness of strangers. This protection wasn't merely about being nice or maintaining good public relations, though those factors certainly played a role. It was about David's understanding of leadership and justice. He knew that how he acted now in these wilderness years would shape what kind of king he would become. He knew that God was watching, that his character was being tested and refined. He knew that the men who followed him were learning from his example, absorbing his values, becoming the kind of soldiers and leaders who would help him build a kingdom when the time came. The days in the wilderness were long and uncertain. David knew he was destined to be king, yet he lived as a fugitive. He had been chosen by God, yet he hid in caves. He commanded hundreds of loyal men, yet possessed no kingdom. This contradiction defined his existence: anointed but uncrowned, powerful but powerless, righteous but hunted. In these years of waiting, David learned patience. He learned to trust in divine timing rather than his own ambition. Twice he had opportunities to kill Saul and seize the throne by force, and twice he refused, unwilling to raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. Even though that same anointed king sought his destruction, David would not force God's hand. He would not take by violence what had been promised to him through providence. The first opportunity came in a cave at En-Gedi, where Saul entered alone, unaware that David and his men were hiding in the darkness deeper within. David's men whispered that God had delivered Saul into their hands, that this was the moment they had been waiting for. But David refused to kill Saul. Instead, he crept forward and cut off a corner of Saul's robe, then immediately felt guilty even for that small act of disrespect toward God's anointed. When Saul left the cave, David emerged and called out to him, showing him the piece of robe, proving that he could have killed Saul, but chose mercy instead. The second opportunity came in the wilderness of Ziph, where David and his nephew Abishai crept into Saul's camp at night and found the king sleeping, his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Again, David's companion urged him to kill Saul. One thrust of that spear would end the threat, forever. Again, David refused, taking only the spear and a water jug as proof of their visit, leaving Saul alive despite the danger he represented. These incidents revealed David's character. He would not compromise his principles even when doing so would have solved all his problems. He would not sin to escape persecution. He would not take by violence what God had promised to give him through providence. This restraint was not weakness but strength, the strength of a man who trusted God enough to wait, even when waiting was agonizing. But patience, as anyone who has practiced it knows, can be worn thin by hardship. And in the wilderness, hardship was the only constant companion. The sun beat down mercilessly during the day. The cold crept in at night. Water was scarce. Food was uncertain. Danger lurked constantly, not just from Saul's pursuing army, but from the wild animals and hostile tribes that inhabited the desert places. David and his men existed in a state of perpetual alertness, never fully resting, always watching the horizons for signs of threat. They moved frequently, never staying in one place long enough to be tracked and cornered. They relied on the hospitality of those who supported David's cause, but such supporters were increasingly reluctant to help openly, fearing Saul's reprisal. In this context of constant stress and uncertainty, maintaining discipline and morale became a daily challenge. Men who were hungry and tired could become dangerous and unpredictable. Men who felt dishonoured could demand satisfaction. Men who had given up everything to follow a fugitive king needed to believe that their sacrifice meant something, that the promises would eventually be fulfilled. David understood all of this. He understood that leadership in the wilderness required not just military skill, but emotional intelligence, not just strategic thinking, but moral clarity. His men needed to see that their cause was just, that their leader was worthy, that their suffering had purpose. This is why the insult from Nabal cut so deeply. It wasn't just a personal affront to David, it was an attack on the entire enterprise, a public declaration that David and his men were worthless, that their protection meant nothing, that they deserved no respect or consideration. For men living on the edge of survival, maintaining their honour was not a luxury but a necessity. Without honour, they were just bandits. With honour, they were a kingdom waiting to be born. Chapter 2. The Wealthy Fool. Not far from where David and his men made their camp, In the fertile regions where the wilderness gave way to cultivated land, there lived a man named Nabal. His name meant fool, and seldom has a name been more prophetically appropriate. Whether his parents named him this at birth, recognizing something in his infant character, or whether it was a name he acquired later in life due to his behaviour, the text does not say. But by the time we meet him in this story, the name fits perfectly. Nabal was a fool, not in the sense of lacking intelligence. He had successfully managed substantial business operations and accumulated significant wealth. But in the deeper biblical sense of moral and spiritual folly, he was a fool because he lived as if there were no consequences to his actions, as if power and wealth made him immune to the natural order of justice, as if he could treat others with contempt without eventually facing the results of that contempt. Nabal was extraordinarily wealthy by the standards of his time and place. He owned 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, a fortune in livestock that required numerous servants and shepherds to manage. His wealth came from the land around Maon, and his business operations extended into Carmel, a fertile region where his flocks could graze and multiply. To put this wealth in perspective, most families in ancient Israel might own a few sheep or goats. A moderately prosperous family might have a dozen or two. A wealthy family might have 50 or 100. Nabal had thousands. His flocks represented not just wealth, but power, economic influence, social status, the ability to employ many people and control significant resources. This wealth had come to him through inheritance, business acumen, or some combination of both. The text doesn't detail how he acquired it, but it does make clear that he knew how to maintain and grow it. Shearing season, when his sheep were harvested for their wool, was a major commercial event that generated substantial revenue. The wool would be sold to traders, who would transport it to cities where it would be processed into cloth, which would then be made into garments. Nabal sat at the beginning of this economic chain, producing the raw material that fed an entire industry. Despite his material abundance, Nabal was poor in the qualities that truly matter. He was harsh in his dealings with others, seeing every interaction as a transaction to be one rather than a relationship to be honoured. He was stubborn, refusing to consider perspectives other than his own. He spoke cruelly and acted without wisdom, believing that his wealth gave him license to treat others with contempt. His harshness manifested in multiple ways. He drove hard bargains with those who had to deal with him, using his economic power to extract maximum value while giving minimum compensation. He spoke roughly to his servants, treating them not as people with dignity but as tools to be used. He ignored the traditional expectations of hospitality and generosity that were central to his culture's moral framework, acting as if his wealth exempted him from social obligations that others had to honour. His stubbornness meant that once he had decided on a course of action, no amount of reasoning could change his mind. He didn't see this as a flaw, but as strength of character, the ability to stick to his guns, to not be swayed by the opinions of others, to maintain his course regardless of circumstances. But there's a difference between principled consistency and foolish inflexibility. Nabal had the latter. He couldn't distinguish between standing firm on important matters and simply being too proud to admit he might be wrong. His household suffered under his character. Servants spoke of him in whispers, careful not to draw his attention or provoke his anger. Those who worked his fields and tended his flocks did so out of necessity, not loyalty. They feared him but didn't respect him. They obeyed him but didn't honour him. The difference might seem subtle, but it's profound. Fear can compel outward compliance, but it breeds resentment and disloyalty. Respect and honour, by contrast, create genuine commitment and faithfulness. The servants in Nabal's household developed elaborate strategies for managing his temper and minimising their contact with him. They learned to anticipate his moods, to stay out of his way when he was in a particularly foul disposition, to present information in ways that wouldn't trigger his anger. It was an exhausting way to live, always walking on eggshells, always calculating how to avoid the next explosion. Nabal inspired fear, perhaps, but never respect. Obedience, certainly, but never devotion. When his servants spoke of him among themselves, It was with resignation and barely concealed contempt. They stayed because they needed employment, because their families depended on the wages he paid, because leaving would mean starting over somewhere else with no guarantee of finding better circumstances. But they would have felt no particular loyalty if circumstances changed. They served Nabal, but they didn't serve him willingly. In this same household lived Nabal's wife, Abigail. The contrast between husband and wife could not have been more striking. Where Nabal was foolish, Abigail was wise. Where he was harsh, she was kind. Where he acted impulsively, she thought carefully. Scripture describes her as intelligent and beautiful, but these surface qualities barely hinted at the depths of her character. Abigail possessed what the ancient Hebrews called chokmah, wisdom that goes beyond mere knowledge to encompass understanding, discernment, and the ability to act rightly in complex situations. She saw not just what was, but what could be. She understood not just facts, but consequences. She could read situations with remarkable accuracy, perceiving the dynamics at play, the motivations of the people involved, the likely outcomes of various courses of action. This kind of wisdom is different from intelligence, though the two often go together. A person can be intelligent, able to learn quickly, to remember facts, to solve abstract problems, without being wise. Wisdom requires not just mental capacity, but emotional maturity, moral clarity, and what we might call situational awareness. It requires seeing the world as it truly is rather than as we wish it to be, and then acting appropriately based on that clear vision. Abigail also possessed tremendous emotional intelligence. She could read people, understanding not just what they said, but what they meant, not just what they claimed to feel, but what they actually felt. This ability made her effective in managing difficult situations and navigating complex social dynamics. She knew when to speak and when to remain silent, when to act boldly and when to exercise patience, when to be direct and when to be diplomatic. In a household ruled by folly, she maintained an island of reason. The servants knew they could come to her when problems arose that needed genuine wisdom, rather than Nabal's typical bluster and cruelty. She quietly smoothed over many situations that her husband's foolishness created, maintaining relationships with neighbours and business partners that Nabal would have destroyed through his harsh dealing. She was, in many ways, the real power holding the household together, even though her husband held the official authority. How she came to be married to such a man, we can only speculate. Perhaps it was an arranged marriage, as was common in that culture. Perhaps her family needed the economic alliance that marriage to a wealthy man provided. Perhaps Nabal had once been different, his character corroded over time by unchecked wealth and power, the way copper turns green with oxidation. Perhaps Abigail had simply done what countless wise people throughout history have done when circumstances placed them under foolish authority. She made the best of an impossible situation, exercising what influence she could while navigating the limitations she could not change. The text doesn't give us her inner thoughts about her marriage, doesn't tell us whether she had loved Nabal once or had always seen him clearly for what he was. It doesn't reveal whether she had been married to him for years or decades, whether they had children together, whether she had ever tried to reform his character or had long since given up that hope. What we know is that she had learned to survive in a difficult household, to maintain her own integrity while married to a man without integrity, to exercise wisdom even when surrounded by foolishness. Whatever the reason for their union, Abigail had learned to live with a difficult truth. She could not change her husband, but she could, when necessary, protect him from the consequences of his own folly. She had probably done this many times before in smaller ways, smoothing over an insult he had given, quietly compensating someone he had cheated, making excuses for behaviour that needed no excuse but would create problems if not addressed. She would soon need to do exactly that, but on a scale she had never faced before. This time, protecting Nabal from the consequences of his folly would require not just quiet diplomacy, but extraordinary courage. This time, the stakes would not be a lost business deal or a damaged reputation, but the lives of everyone in the household. Chapter 3. The Request and the Insult. Shearing time came to Carmel, a season of celebration and prosperity. The sheep had grown their wool through the year, and now that wool would be harvested, sold, and transformed into wealth. For a man as rich as Nabal, shearing time meant the movement of tremendous value, and traditionally, it was also a time of generosity, when wealthy landowners shared their abundance with those who had helped them throughout the year. The cultural expectations around shearing time were well established. It was understood that landowners would host feasts for their workers, would give gifts to those who had provided assistance during the year, would demonstrate through their generosity that they understood their wealth came not just from their own efforts, but from the broader community's support and cooperation. Stinginess during shearing time was considered shameful, a violation of social norms that could damage a person's reputation and standing in the community. David learned that Nabal was shearing his sheep in Carmel. He knew that his men had spent months protecting those very shepherds and flocks, forming a wall of protection around them in the lawless wilderness. Not a single sheep had been stolen, not one shepherd had been harmed. The shepherds themselves had acknowledged this protection, had been grateful for it, had recognized that David's men could have taken what they wanted but instead had acted honorably. The protection David's men had provided was substantial and valuable. The wilderness was full of threats, raiding parties from neighboring tribes, wild animals like lions and bears, even individual thieves who would steal sheep and disappear into the wasteland. Shepherds were vulnerable, often young men or boys armed with nothing more than a staff and a sling. The presence of David's armed warriors created a zone of safety around Nabal's flocks that would otherwise not have existed. Moreover, David's men had not just refrained from stealing, they had actively protected the shepherds and flocks from others who would have stolen. This was the service of professional soldiers, security that someone like Nabal would normally have to pay for. David had provided it for free, asking nothing at the time, trusting in the traditional customs of hospitality and reciprocity that governed relations in that society. David's band had asked for nothing in return at the time, but now, at this season of plenty, he thought it reasonable to request some provisions. This was not extortion or a protection racket, though some might try to characterize it that way. This was a legitimate request based on services rendered, framed within the cultural expectations of that time and place. David was not demanding specific payment or threatening consequences. He was simply asking, during a season of abundance, if Nabal might share some of his prosperity with those who had helped protect it. He chose 10 young men from among his followers and gave them careful instructions. They were to approach Nabal with respect and courtesy. They were to greet him with words of peace and blessing. They were to remind him of the protection David's men had provided. And they were to make a humble request for whatever provisions Nabal felt appropriate to share. David's careful instructions reveal his understanding of how to approach such situations. He didn't send his most intimidating warriors or his roughest veterans. He sent young men who would seem less threatening. He didn't demand or threaten. He requested humbly. He didn't specify what he wanted or how much. He left it to Nabal's discretion, trusting in the man's sense of obligation and generosity. The messengers found Nabal at Carmel and delivered their message exactly as instructed. They spoke with deference and humility. They emphasized peace and friendship. They detailed the protection they had provided without compensation. And they asked, politely, if Nabal might share some food with David's men during this prosperous time. The greeting they delivered was formal and respectful. Long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours. Now I hear that it is sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them, and the whole time they were at Carmel nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they will tell you. Therefore be favourable toward my men, since we come at a festive time. Please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them. Every element of this message was calibrated to be non-threatening and respectful. The blessing at the beginning, the acknowledgement that this was a festive time, the invitation to verify their claims with his own servants, the humble request for whatever he could spare, the reference to David as Nabal's son, a term of respect indicating David's willingness to position himself as Nabal's inferior in this exchange. Nothing in the message could reasonably be interpreted as threatening or disrespectful. Nabal's response revealed the full extent of his character, his foolishness, his contempt for those he considered beneath him. "Who is David?" he sneered. "Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where?" The insult was carefully constructed and deliberately offensive. Every phrase was chosen to wound, to diminish, to express contempt. "Who is David?" This opening question pretended ignorance of one of the most famous men in Israel. David had killed Goliath in front of 2 armies. He had led successful military campaigns. He had been celebrated in songs sung throughout the nation. Everyone knew who David was. Nabal's pretense of not knowing was a calculated insult, suggesting that David was so insignificant as to be beneath notice. Who is this son of Jesse? By reducing David to son of Jesse, Nabal stripped him of any titles or honours, any recognition of his accomplishments. He wasn't the warrior who killed Goliath. He wasn't the commander who routed the Philistines. He was just Jesse's boy, a nobody from nowhere, presumably someone of no importance or standing. Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. This comparison was particularly venomous. Nabal was explicitly comparing David and his men to runaway slaves, to criminals who had fled their legal obligations, to rebels without legitimate cause. He was saying that David was not a warrior or a leader, but an outlaw, a troublemaker, someone who had abandoned his proper place in society and now lived outside the bounds of law and decency. "Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I've slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where?" This final section doubled down on the insult. By calling his provisions my bread, my water, my meat, emphasizing the possessive, emphasizing his ownership, Nabal made clear that he felt no obligation to share anything with anyone. The phrase, "men coming from who knows where," suggested that David's men were not just strangers, but potentially dangerous drifters, people of unknown origin and probably criminal character. The entire response violated every norm of hospitality, generosity, and basic human decency that governed that culture. Even if Nabal had wanted to refuse the request, there were polite ways to do so. He could have claimed he had already distributed all his excess provisions. He could have offered a token amount as a gesture of goodwill. He could have explained that times were hard and he needed to be careful with his resources. Any of these responses would have been socially acceptable, maintaining face for both parties. Instead, Nabal chose the most offensive possible response. He didn't just refuse help, he mocked and insulted the men who had provided him protection. He didn't just say no, he impugned their character, questioned their legitimacy, and treated them with open contempt. The messengers returned to David with empty hands and full reports of Nabal's contemptuous response. As they spoke, repeating Nabal's insults word for word, David's face darkened with anger. We can imagine the scene, the messengers delivering their report, probably with some embarrassment on behalf of the man they served, and David's reaction building as each phrase of Nabal's response was recounted. Here was a man who had treated David's kindness as weakness, who had returned good with evil, who had mocked and insulted him before his own men. David's restraint, his patience, his honour, all of it had been thrown back in his face by a wealthy fool who apparently believed his riches made him untouchable. For David, this was more than a personal insult. It was an attack on his authority, his legitimacy, his honour before his men. The men who followed David had given up everything to join him. Their homes, their security, their place in normal society. They followed him because they believed in him, because they thought he was destined for greatness, because they trusted his leadership. If David allowed himself and his men to be insulted with impunity, if he let some wealthy landowner treat them with contempt without consequences, how long before his authority eroded? How long before his men started to doubt whether following him had been the right choice? David's response was immediate and decisive. "Each of you strap on your sword," he commanded his men. They obeyed without hesitation, and 400 armed warriors prepared to march on Nabal's household. David himself strapped on his sword as well, his jaw set in grim determination. 400 men. Not a small raiding party, but a small army. Enough warriors to overwhelm any defence Nabal's household could mount to ensure total victory, to make absolutely certain that the message would be delivered with devastating force. As they marched, David's thoughts spiralled into righteous fury. His anger was not irrational. By any reasonable standard, he had been wronged. He had provided valuable service and asked reasonable compensation. He had approached respectfully and been answered with contempt. By the standards of that time and culture, he would have been justified in seeking satisfaction for the insult. It's been useless, all my watching over this fellow's property in the wilderness so that nothing of his was missing, he said to those around him, his voice bitter with the taste of betrayal. He has paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him. The oath was traditional and binding. David had sworn before God that he would kill every man in Nabal's household before the sun rose again. Not just Nabal himself, but every male in the household. Servants, shepherds, anyone who lived under Nabal's authority. It was a blood oath, the kind that could not be taken back easily, the kind that committed David to a course of action from which retreat would bring shame. This oath reveals both David's fury and the cultural context in which he operated. In that time and place, honour killings in response to grievous insults were not uncommon. A man who failed to defend his honour and the honour of his men risked losing their respect and loyalty. The ancient world operated on codes of honour and shame that modern readers sometimes find difficult to fully understand. David was not being randomly violent. He was responding according to the logic of his culture and his circumstances. Yet even in his anger, even in his oath, there was something troubling. 400 warriors marching to slaughter an entire household because the head of that household had been rude. Women and children and servants who had done nothing wrong would die alongside the guilty party. This felt less like justice and more like massacre, less like righteous anger and more like disproportionate vengeance. But David, consumed by his fury, was not thinking clearly about proportionality or justice. He was thinking about respect and honour, about protecting his position as leader, about demonstrating to his men that no one could treat them with contempt without facing consequences. 400 warriors marched through the wilderness toward Carmel. Behind them, dust rose in clouds visible for miles. Before them, death waited to be delivered. The machinery of vengeance had been set in motion, and nothing, it seemed, could stop it. The march would take several hours, enough time for word to reach Nabal's household, enough time for terror to build, enough time for people to realise that death was coming and there was nothing they could do to stop it. But this reckoning had not accounted for Abigail. No one had considered that there might be someone in Nabal's household who possessed the wisdom to see a different path, the courage to take it, and the skill to persuade an angry warrior to abandon his sworn oath. Chapter 4. The Wisdom of a Careful Listener. One of Nabal's young servants, observing the exchange between his master and David's messengers, immediately understood the catastrophic danger. Unlike his employer, this young man possessed both intelligence and survival instinct. He didn't waste time trying to convince Nabal to change his mind. He knew that would be futile. Instead, he went directly to the one person in the household who might be able to do something: Abigail. The servant's decision to approach Abigail rather than Nabal tells us something important about the household dynamics. The servants knew who really held power, who could really solve problems, who possessed the wisdom and capability to address crises. It wasn't the man who held official authority. It was the woman who had earned genuine respect through her character and competence. David sent messengers from the wilderness to give our master his greetings, the servant explained urgently, his words tumbling out in his haste to convey the full scope of the danger. But he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us, and the whole time we were herding our sheep near them, nothing was missing. Night and day they were a wall around us the entire time we were with them taking care of our flocks. The servant's testimony was crucial. He confirmed that David's claims were absolutely true. The protection had been real, substantial, and valuable. He used vivid language, a wall around us night and day, to convey how complete and reliable that protection had been. He wanted Abigail to understand that David's request had been entirely reasonable, and that Nabal's refusal was not just rude but unjust. "Now think it over and see what you can do," he continued, his voice dropping to emphasize the gravity of what came next. "Because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He's such a wicked man that no one can talk to him." This final statement reveals multiple truths. First, the servant openly called his master wicked, showing that Nabal's character was recognized and condemned even by those who served him. Second, he acknowledged that talking to Nabal was impossible. The man could not be reasoned with, could not be persuaded, could not be made to see sense. Third, and most importantly, he made clear that the coming disaster would affect everyone, not just Nabal. Innocent people, servants, shepherds, women, children, would all die because of one man's foolish pride. The servant's message contained several crucial elements. First, he confirmed the truth of David's claims. The protection had been real and valuable. Second, he acknowledged his master's character. Nabal was indeed a fool who would not listen to reason. Third, he recognized the danger. Disaster was coming for the entire household, not just for Nabal himself. Fourth, he understood that disaster could be prevented if someone acted wisely and quickly. And fifth, by coming to Abigail, he implicitly acknowledged that she was the only person capable of addressing this crisis. Abigail listened carefully to every word. While others might have panicked or despaired at the news, her mind immediately began calculating options and strategies. She knew David's reputation. He was no ordinary bandit, but a proven warrior who had killed giants and routed armies. She knew that 400 armed men could annihilate everything and everyone in Nabal's household in a matter of hours. She understood that her husband's stubbornness made it impossible to reason with him directly, and she realized, with crystal clarity, that she had perhaps a few hours at most to prevent a massacre. Most importantly, Abigail understood something that her husband had failed to grasp. David was not just a wilderness chieftain, but the anointed future king of Israel. The prophet Samuel's anointing was known among those who paid attention to such things, even if the anointing had been conducted in secret. David's character, his victories, his supernatural protection from Saul's repeated attempts to kill him, all of this pointed to a man marked by destiny, chosen by God for a purpose. To insult such a man was not just rude, it was cosmically foolish, setting oneself against not just a powerful warrior, but against God's own chosen instrument. But Abigail also understood something else about David. He was a man who valued honour and righteousness. He had spared Saul's life when he could have taken it. He maintained discipline among his men in the lawless wilderness. He protected shepherds rather than robbing them. This was a man who could be reasoned with, if the reasoning was sound and the approach was wise. This was a man who had a conscience, who cared about doing right, who would listen to wisdom if it was presented properly. She made her decision instantly. She would act without consulting her husband, because consulting him would accomplish nothing except wasting precious time. She would take full responsibility for her actions, and she would trust that wisdom, properly applied, could accomplish what force could never achieve. Abigail moved with remarkable speed and efficiency. She understood that time was critical. Every minute that passed brought David's army closer to her household. She ordered her servants to gather provisions, and she specified generous quantities that would show real respect and appreciation. 200 loaves of bread, enough to feed David's entire band with some left over. 2 skins of wine, not cheap wine, but good quality wine appropriate for an important gift. 5 dressed sheep, already slaughtered and prepared for roasting. Substantial amount of meat, the kind of provision that required real effort and expense. Nearly 8 gallons of roasted grain, portable, nutritious, practical for men living in the wilderness. 100 cakes of raisins, sweet, energy-dense, valuable. 200 cakes of pressed figs, another luxury item showing that this was not some grudging minimum offering, but a genuine expression of generosity. These were substantial quantities, the kind of provision that showed both respect and generosity. More than what David had originally requested, enough to feed his entire band well. Abigail was not merely trying to buy her way out of trouble. She was correcting her husband's insult with genuine generosity, demonstrating the kind of hospitality that Nabal should have shown in the first place. The choice of provisions was strategic. She selected items that were valuable and appreciated, wine and meat and sweets, but also practical for men living in the wilderness. These were things David's men could use immediately and would genuinely appreciate. She was showing respect not just through the quantity, but through the thought put into what would actually be helpful and welcome. She had these provisions loaded onto donkeys, creating a visible caravan that would be impossible to miss. The sight of multiple donkeys loaded with food and wine would immediately communicate peaceful intent, would signal that whoever was coming was bringing gifts rather than weapons, was seeking reconciliation rather than conflict. She gave her servants explicit instructions. "Go on ahead, I'll follow you." This arrangement was carefully planned. The servants would arrive first, their laden donkeys making clear that this was a mission of peace and generosity. They would begin unloading the provisions, creating a visual tableau of abundance and goodwill. And then Abigail would arrive, able to speak with David after the initial impact of the generous provisions had already begun to soften his anger. The servants departed immediately, creating a caravan that would be visible from a distance. Meanwhile, Abigail told Nabal nothing. There was no point. He would either forbid her mission, and she would have to disobey him anyway, or he would ignore her warning, secure in his foolish confidence that his wealth made him untouchable. Either way, consulting him would waste time they didn't have. This was a moment that required action, not permission. Some might question whether Abigail was right to act without her husband's knowledge or consent. After all, wasn't she violating the proper order of authority in the household? Wasn't she being disobedient to her husband? But biblical wisdom literature consistently affirms that there are times when a higher principle must take precedence over a lower one. The preservation of innocent life takes precedence over formal procedures. Preventing evil takes precedence over maintaining appearances. Doing right takes precedence over doing what's expected. Abigail understood that this was one of those moments when wisdom required her to act beyond the normal boundaries of her role, because staying within those boundaries would result in catastrophe. She mounted her own donkey and began riding toward the wilderness, toward the armed men marching to destroy her household. She rode alone, following her servants at a distance, moving steadily toward the confrontation that would determine whether wisdom or violence would prevail. As she rode, Abigail likely prayed. She would have asked God for wisdom in choosing her words, for courage to speak boldly when the moment came, for divine favour in turning David's heart from vengeance. She would have committed herself and her mission to God's providence, trusting that if she acted rightly, God would honour her faithfulness. She also likely considered carefully what she would say when she met David face to face. She understood that words would be her only weapons, and that those words would need to be chosen with perfect precision. Too much deference might seem insincere or manipulative. Too little might inflame David's anger further. She would need to acknowledge the wrong done to him while not defending her husband's actions. She would need to appeal to David's better nature while respecting his legitimate grievances. She would need to remind him of his destiny without seeming to lecture him. She would need to turn his anger away from violence without suggesting that his anger itself was unjustified. All of this would need to be accomplished while speaking to a man she had never met, who was currently marching toward her home with 400 armed warriors intent on slaughter, who had sworn an oath before God to kill every male in her household before morning. The odds were not in her favour. A wrong word, a misjudged tone, a poorly chosen argument, any of these could result in David dismissing her and continuing his march toward violence. But wisdom, Abigail knew, often succeeds precisely when the odds suggest it should fail. And she was about to demonstrate that principle in a way that would be remembered for thousands of years. Chapter 5. The Meeting in the Ravine. The geography of that fateful encounter is significant and worth pausing to consider. Abigail rode down into a mountain ravine, a place where the land itself created natural walls on either side, focusing attention, limiting distractions, creating a kind of natural amphitheatre where every word would carry weight and importance. Ravines in that region were formed by seasonal water flow. carved over centuries by occasional flash floods that rushed through during the rainy season. During the dry season, they became natural passages through the mountainous terrain, shadowed by the steep walls on either side, cooler than the exposed hillsides, often the quickest route between locations but also potential places of ambush. And there, coming from the opposite direction, she saw them. David and his men, 400 warriors, armed and grim-faced, marching with the purposeful stride of men committed to violence. At their head, David himself still burning with the fury of insult and betrayal. They had come too far to turn back easily. The momentum of anger carried them forward, and the oath David had sworn gave that momentum the force of sacred obligation. Imagine the visual impact of that moment. Abigail, a woman alone on a donkey, riding toward an army. The contrast could not have been more stark. 1 against 400. Peace against war, wisdom against fury. Any reasonable person would have been terrified. But Abigail's courage came not from absence of fear, but from conviction that what she was doing was right and necessary. When Abigail saw David, she acted quickly, her movements deliberate and practiced. She dismounted from her donkey and bowed down before him with her face to the ground, the deepest form of respect and submission in her. Culture. This was not weakness, but strategy. She immediately diffused any perception that she came in defiance or pride. She acknowledged David's authority and position. She showed humility without grovelling, respect without civility. The act of dismounting and bowing would have required David and his men to stop. They couldn't simply march past a woman prostrated in their path. This gave Abigail her opening, created the space for words to be spoken and heard. Then she spoke, and in speaking she demonstrated why wisdom is sometimes called the highest gift, why Solomon asked God for wisdom above all other possible gifts, why the book of Proverbs consistently presents wisdom as more valuable than gold or silver or any material treasure. "Pardon your servant, my lord, and let me speak to you," she began, her voice clear and steady despite the circumstances. "Hear what your servant has to say. Please pay no attention to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him. And as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my lord sent." Notice the structure and wisdom of her opening. She asked permission to speak, showing respect for David's authority, even though he had no formal authority over her. She referred to herself as your servant multiple times, positioning herself as someone under David's care rather than as an adversary or even a neutral party. This was strategic. By calling herself his servant, she appealed to his responsibility as a leader to listen to those under his protection. She immediately disavowed her husband's actions, calling Nabal what he was, wicked and foolish. She didn't make excuses for him, didn't try to minimize what he had done, didn't ask David to understand or forgive Nabal's perspective. She simply acknowledged the truth. Nabal was a fool, and his response had been foolish. By doing this, she separated herself from his actions while taking responsibility for her household's obligations. She explained that she had not been present when David's messengers came, establishing that she bore no personal responsibility for the insult. This wasn't an excuse but a statement of fact. If she had been there, the implication was clear. Things would have gone differently. David's men would have been welcomed and provided for as they deserved. In these opening sentences, Abigail accomplished several things simultaneously. She showed respect without weakness. She acknowledged wrong without defending it. She established her own character as distinct from her husband's. She created a foundation for everything else she was about to say. But Abigail was just beginning. She continued, her words carefully chosen, building her argument with the precision of a skilled advocate. "And now, my lord, as surely as the Lord your God lives, and as you live, since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, may your enemies and all who are intent on harming my lord be like Nabal, and let this gift, which your servant has brought to my lord, be given to the men who follow you." This passage is masterful in its construction, revealing Abigail's deep understanding of how to appeal to a person's better nature. She invoked the name of God, reminding David that his actions would be witnessed and judged by a higher authority than any human. She didn't threaten David with divine judgment. That would have been counterproductive. But she framed the situation in terms of David's relationship with God. She reframed what was happening in the present moment. David had not yet shed blood. God, through Abigail's intervention, was keeping him from that action. By framing it this way, she made it easier for David to change course without losing face. He wasn't backing down from his oath. He was accepting God's intervention to prevent him from doing something he would later regret. She pronounced a curse on David's real enemies, lumping Nabal, together with them as equally foolish and deserving of divine judgment. This was clever. She wasn't asking David to forget the offence or pretend it didn't matter. She was simply asking him to leave the judgment to God rather than taking it into his own hands. David's honour would be satisfied through divine justice rather than human violence. She called the provision she had brought a gift freely given, restoring honour to the interaction. This wasn't payment extracted under duress or compensation offered out of fear. It was a gift from a friend, the kind of generous provision that should have been offered in the first place. By framing it as a gift, she allowed David to accept it without feeling that he was being bought off or manipulated. She pressed on, speaking with increasing boldness, her confidence growing as she saw that David was actually listening. "Please forgive your servant's presumption. The Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my Lord, because you fight the Lord's battles and no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my Lord will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling." Here, Abigail revealed her understanding of David's true identity and destiny. This was not information available to just anyone. The fact that she knew about David's anointing, knew about God's promises to him, knew about his destiny to establish a lasting dynasty. All of this showed that she was a woman who paid attention to what mattered, who understood the deeper spiritual realities beneath the surface events of her time. She knew he would establish a dynasty, not hoped, not guessed, but knew with the certainty of faith in God's promises. She knew he fought the Lord's battles, framing his military activities not as those of a bandit or rebel, but as someone carrying out divine purposes. She knew that no wrongdoing would be found in him. This was both a statement of confidence in his character and a subtle warning that if he slaughtered her household, that would be wrongdoing that would stain his record. She used beautiful imagery to describe God's protection of David. Bound securely in the bundle of the living, evoked the image of something precious being wrapped carefully and protected, the way valuable items were bundled for safekeeping. David's life was in God's hands, protected by divine care, immune to the schemes of his enemies no matter how powerful they seemed. And then she reminded him of his greatest victory, referencing his defeat of Goliath with a sling, turning that image into a promise that God would handle his enemies just as David had once felled a giant. With a single stone from a sling, David had defeated Israel's greatest enemy. With similar efficiency and power, God would deal with all of David's foes. The message was clear. David didn't need to take vengeance into his own hands. God was fully capable of handling his enemies. Then came the crucial turning point, the heart of her argument, the appeal that would ultimately change everything. "When the Lord has fulfilled for my Lord every good thing he promised concerning him, and has appointed him ruler over Israel, my Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself. And when the Lord your God has brought my Lord success, remember your servant." This was the masterstroke, the argument that cut through all the anger and wounded pride to touch something deeper in David's character. Abigail asked David to think not about the present moment of anger, but about his future. She asked him to imagine himself years from now, sitting on Israel's throne, looking back on this day. When he became king, not if, but when, treating his future as an established fact, speaking with the confidence of faith, would he want to look back on this day with regret? Would he want to carry the weight of having slaughtered an entire household over an insult? Would he want his conscience stained with unnecessary violence? Would he want to remember that he had killed innocent people because their master had been rude to him? She called it the staggering burden of needless bloodshed, acknowledging that taking life has weight, has consequences, leaves marks on the soul of the one who does it. Even justified killing carries weight. But needless killing, disproportionate killing, killing driven by anger rather than justice, that kind of bloodshed becomes a burden that never fully lifts, a stain that never quite washes clean. She appealed to David's conscience, to his sense of who he was and who he wanted to be. She reminded him that he was not just a warrior but a man of God, not just a fighter, but someone called to lead God's people. She called him to his higher self, to the man God had anointed him to be, not the angry warrior he was in that moment. And notice what she didn't do. She never directly criticised David. She never suggested that his anger was unjustified, or that Nabal's insult didn't matter. She never implied that David was wrong to feel offended, or that he should simply swallow the insult and move on. Instead, she elevated David above the situation. She reminded him that he was destined for greater things than petty vengeance. She showed him a path forward that would preserve his honour without requiring violence. Her final request, "Remember your servant," was both humble and wise. She wasn't demanding reward or recognition. She was simply asking David to remember that she had helped him avoid a terrible mistake. And the phrase carried an implied promise. When David became king, when he held power and authority, she trusted that he would remember this day and the woman who had shown him wisdom. Throughout her speech, which probably lasted only a few minutes but contained the distilled wisdom of a lifetime, Abigail demonstrated mastery of persuasive communication. She showed respect while speaking boldly. She acknowledged legitimate grievances while pointing toward better responses. She appealed to self-interest while grounding everything in spiritual truth. She offered practical solutions while addressing deeper principles. Most importantly, she spoke as someone who believed in David, who saw not just who he was in that moment, but who he was meant to become. She spoke as someone who understood that great leaders sometimes need to be reminded of their greatness, that angry men sometimes need to be shown a path away from their anger, that pride sometimes needs to be given away to back down without losing face. Chapter 6. When wisdom dissolves. Fury, David stood silent as Abigail spoke, listening to every word. The men around him watched, probably with some surprise, wondering how their commander would respond to this unexpected intervention. They had been marching toward violence, committed to an oath, convinced of the righteousness of their cause. Now here was this woman, speaking words that challenged everything they had been thinking, offering a perspective they hadn't considered. The moment stretched, balanced between violence and peace, between the momentum of anger and the pull of wisdom. David's next words would determine whether 400 warriors would turn back or continue forward, whether an entire household would live or die. Then David spoke, and in his words, everyone present heard the sound of anger transforming into something else entirely, not disappearing, but being redirected, being elevated, being refined into something better than blind rage. "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me," David said, his voice carrying a note of wonder, as if he was only now fully recognizing how close he had come to disaster. "May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak." These words revealed several truths about David's character and about what had just happened. First, David recognized divine intervention. God had sent Abigail to stop him. This wasn't just a lucky accident or a clever woman taking initiative. This was providence, divine orchestration, God actively working to prevent David from making a terrible mistake. Second, he acknowledged that Abigail had saved him from bloodshed. Not saved Nabal, that's what we might expect him to say, but saved David himself. He understood that he was the one who needed saving, that he was the one about to commit an act he would regret. The violence would have stained him more than it would have hurt Nabal, who would have been dead and beyond regret. Third, he confirmed what he had intended to do. The slaughter would have been total. Not one male would have survived. He didn't soften this or try to minimize it. He stated it plainly, acknowledging the full extent of what he had been about to do, owning the reality that his anger had been leading him toward mass murder. Fourth, by speaking these things aloud before his men, David demonstrated the kind of leadership that would eventually make him a great king. He didn't try to save face by pretending he hadn't really meant it, didn't minimize his anger or the oath he had sworn. Instead, he publicly acknowledged that he had been wrong, that he had needed correction, that this woman's wisdom had been greater than his fury. This is what wisdom does in the presence of anger. It doesn't deny the anger or call it invalid. It doesn't argue against the reasons for the anger, or suggest that the offended party should just get over it. Instead, it provides perspective, appeals to deeper values, offers a path forward that preserves honour without requiring violence. Wisdom acknowledges that anger can be righteous while still recognising that righteous anger can lead to unrighteous actions. It creates space for people to change course without losing face, to redirect their energy toward better ends without denying the legitimacy of their feelings. David accepted the provisions Abigail had brought, a visible sign that he was accepting her entire message, not just taking the food while continuing with his original plan. "Go home in peace," he told her, his voice now calm, the fury drained away. "I have heard your words and granted your request." Those simple words contained multitudes. David acknowledged that he had truly heard her, not just listened to the sound she made, but understood the wisdom she was offering. He had heard her with his mind and his heart, had allowed her words to penetrate past his anger to touch something deeper in his character, and he granted her request, which was nothing less than the lives of everyone in her household. 400 warriors who had sworn to kill every male in Nabal's house would now return to their camps without having shed any blood. Servants who would have died for their master's folly would live. Shepherds who had done nothing wrong would continue tending their flocks. An entire household was saved because one woman had the wisdom to act and the courage to speak. With those words, the crisis ended. The immediate danger passed. 400 warriors who had been marching toward massacre turned around and headed back to their wilderness camps. The machinery of vengeance, once set in motion, had been stopped by the intervention of the wisdom. The men began to disperse, probably with mixed feelings. Some might have felt relief. Killing an entire household isn't something most people want to do, even when they're angry. Some might have felt disappointment. They had worked themselves up for violence and now had to let that energy dissipate without release. Some might have felt admiration for David, seeing in his willingness to change course evidence of the kind of wisdom that makes good leaders. Some might have gained new respect for the power of the well-spoken words to change outcomes that seemed inevitable. Abigail had accomplished the impossible, with no weapons except words, with no authority except her own moral clarity, with no power except the power of truth spoken well. She had prevented a tragedy. She had saved her household from death. She had protected David from a decision he would have regretted for the rest of his life. And she had demonstrated that the right words, spoken at the right time in the right way, can accomplish what armies cannot. As she prepared to return to her household, Abigail must have felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that the immediate danger had passed, exhaustion from the intensity of what she had just experienced. Perhaps some trepidation about what she would face when she returned home and her husband learned what she had done, but also surely a deep satisfaction in knowing that she had done the right thing, that she had acted according to wisdom and conscience, that she had saved innocent lives through her courage and skill. The sun was likely getting lower in the sky by now. The shadows in the ravine would have been lengthening. Abigail mounted her donkey and began the journey home, back to a household that had no idea how close it had come to annihilation, back to a husband who was probably still celebrating his shearing feast without any awareness of the disaster that had been averted. She rode home carrying the knowledge that she had changed history, though she probably didn't think of it in such grand terms. She had simply done what needed to be done, what her wisdom told her was right, what her conscience demanded. She had demonstrated that one person acting with courage, And wisdom at the right moment can change outcomes that seem inevitable, can redirect the course of events, can prevent tragedies that others thought were unstoppable. Chapter 7. The Fate of Folly. Abigail returned to her home in Carmel as evening was settling over the land. The dust of David's departing army had settled behind her. The crisis had passed, but she now faced a different challenge, dealing with her husband and the aftermath of what she had done. She found Nabal hosting a feast, and the description Scripture provides is revealing, a feast like that of a king. This detail tells us much about Nabal's character and self-perception. He wasn't content to have a normal celebration. He had to display his wealth, had to demonstrate his status, had to make sure everyone understood just how rich and important he was. He was drunk, celebrating his wealth and his shearing season, completely unaware that his household had come within hours of annihilation, while Abigail had been racing to intercept David's army, while servants had been loading donkeys with provisions in desperate haste, while 400 armed men had been marching toward them with swords drawn and death in their eyes. Nabal had been drinking wine and congratulating himself on his prosperity. The scene would be almost comical if it weren't so tragic. A man completely oblivious to the danger he had created through his own foolishness, celebrating in ignorance while others saved him from the consequences of his actions. He had no idea that every person at his feast owed their life to his wife's wisdom and courage. He had no idea how close he had come to destroying everything through his stubborn pride. Abigail said nothing to him that night. There was no point in trying to communicate with a drunk man, especially one as foolish as Nabal even when sober. She had learned through long experience that some conversations are futile, that some moments are wrong for truth-telling, that wisdom includes knowing when to speak and when to wait. So she waited through the night, waited through his drunken revelry, waited for morning when sobriety might make understanding possible. We can imagine her during those hours, exhausted from her journey and the emotional intensity of her confrontation with David, but unable to rest, knowing that she still had to face her husband, still had to tell him what she had done, still had to deal with the aftermath of her actions. When morning came and Nabal had sobered up, his head probably aching from the previous night's excess, Abigail told him everything. She didn't soften the truth or minimize the danger. She explained about David's messengers and his own contemptuous response. She described the 400 armed men who had been marching toward their home with sworn intent to kill every male in the household. She detailed her intervention, the provisions she'd taken without his knowledge or permission, and her meeting with David in the ravine. She made absolutely clear exactly how close they had all come to death, how his foolish insult had nearly cost everyone their lives. The news had a dramatic and immediate effect. Scripture says that Nabal's heart failed him, and he became like a stone. This description suggests either a stroke or some form of shock so profound that he became paralyzed, unable to move or speak. Medical historians have speculated about the exact nature of Nabal's condition. Perhaps a massive stroke, perhaps a heart attack, perhaps a psychological shock so severe that it manifested as physical paralysis. Whatever the medical mechanism, the meaning is clear. The man who had been so certain of his own importance and invulnerability, who had been celebrating with royal pretensions just hours earlier, suddenly came face to face with the consequences of his folly, the reality of how close he had come to death, the understanding of how his own actions had nearly destroyed everyone and everything he possessed. The humiliation of learning that his wife had to save him from his own stupidity, all of this crashed down on him with crushing force. Some speculate that what killed Nabal was not just physical shock, but spiritual and psychological devastation. He had built his identity on his wealth and status, on the illusion that his riches made him untouchable and superior. Now he had to confront the reality that his wealth meant nothing in the face of real power, that his status hadn't protected him, that he had been completely vulnerable and had been saved only through the intervention of the wife he had probably treated with contempt. For a proud man, a man whose name meant fool, but who probably believed himself quite clever, this realization might have been more devastating than any physical blow. His entire self-image collapsed. Everything he had believed about himself and the world was revealed as false. And unlike physical injuries which can heal, damage to one's fundamental sense of self can be fatal. He lingered for about 10 days in this condition, neither dead nor truly alive, existing in some twilight state between the two. We don't know if he was conscious during this time, if he could hear or understand what was happening around him, if he experienced this time as suffering or simply as a kind of blankness. The text is spare in its details, telling us only that he remained like a stone for approximately 10 days. Then he died. The text simply states that the Lord struck Nabal and he died, leaving the exact mechanism ambiguous, but the meaning clear. Nabal's death was connected to his character and his actions. God's justice had found him. The consequences he had created through his own foolishness had finally caught up to him. When David heard that Nabal was dead, his response revealed his character and his understanding of what had happened. He didn't gloat over the death of an enemy. He didn't celebrate that someone who had insulted him had suffered and died. Instead, he praised God and acknowledged how God had worked in the entire situation. Praise be to the Lord who has... There are moments in history that seem unremarkable at first glance. A king makes a decision, a prophet speaks a warning, a door closes quietly on an opportunity that will never return. But sometimes these small moments reveal something profound about the human condition, about the space between faith and self-reliance, between humility and pride. Tonight's story takes us to the ancient kingdom of Judah, during a period most historians would describe as relatively peaceful. There were no apocalyptic battles, no dramatic exiles, no nation-ending catastrophes. Instead, there was something far more dangerous, a slow drift away from the very foundation that had brought success in the first place. This is the story of Hanani the seer and King Asa of Judah, a narrative about what happens when a leader who once trusted God completely decides that human alliances offer better security than divine faithfulness. It's a story about the test that comes not during crisis but during comfort, and it reveals a truth that echoes across millennia, that faith proven once must be renewed continually, or it withers in the shadow of our own accomplishments. Chapter 1. A king who began well. The reign of Asa began with the kind of promise that makes historians take notice. When he ascended to the throne of Judah, the kingdom was spiritually fractured, morally compromised, and politically vulnerable. His predecessors had allowed the worship of foreign gods to take root in the land, permitted sacred prostitution at pagan shrines, and tolerated practices that violated everything the covenant with God represented. The nation that was supposed to be set apart had become indistinguishable from its neighbours. Asa inherited this mess as a young king, and the expectations were not high. But something in Asa was different. Perhaps it was the influence of his grandmother Maacah, whom he would later remove from her position as queen mother due to her idol worship. Perhaps it was the counsel of faithful priests who had maintained their devotion despite the surrounding corruption. Or perhaps it was simply a genuine encounter with the God of his ancestors that convinced him the old ways needed to be restored. Whatever the catalyst, Asa made a decision that would define the first decades of his rule. He would return Judah to covenant faithfulness regardless of the cost. The reforms began systematically. Asa ordered the removal of foreign altars throughout the kingdom. He broke down the sacred stones that had been erected to Canaanite deities. He cut down the Asherah poles that stood as symbols of fertility goddess worship. These weren't merely symbolic gestures. In the ancient world, removing religious objects was a direct challenge to the power structures that supported them. Priests lost income, influential families lost status, political alliances built on shared worship practices became strained. But Asa pressed forward, convinced that the spiritual health of the nation mattered more than temporary political convenience. He restored the altar of the Lord that stood in front of the temple portico. He called the people to renew their commitment to the covenant. He assembled the nation and led them in sacrifices and celebrations that recalled the faithfulness of God to their ancestors. The chroniclers record that Asa commanded Judah to seek the Lord, the God of their fathers, and to obey his laws and commands. It was comprehensive spiritual renewal, the kind that reshapes not just religious practice but national identity. The result was remarkable. God granted Asa rest on every side. No enemies rose against Judah during these early years. The kingdom experienced peace and prosperity. Asa used this period of stability to fortify the cities of Judah, building up defences and organising the military. He told the people that because they had sought the Lord, God had given them rest, and they built and prospered. But the real test of Asa's faith came not during the reforms, but afterward, when military threat emerged from an unexpected direction. Zerah the Cushite, commanding a massive army, marched against Judah. The numbers were overwhelming. Judah's organised but relatively modest forces faced an invasion force that included hundreds of thousands of soldiers and 300 chariots. By any conventional military calculation, Judah should have been crushed. Asa's response in that moment defined his early reign. He didn't panic. He didn't immediately seek foreign alliances. He didn't try to negotiate a settlement. Instead, he called out to the Lord his God in a prayer that has echoed through history. Lord, there is no one like you to help the powerless against the mighty. Help us, Lord our God, for we rely on you, and in your name we have come against this vast army. Lord, you are our God. Do not let mere mortals prevail against you. It was a prayer of absolute dependence, a public acknowledgement that Judah's survival rested entirely on divine intervention, and God responded. The chroniclers record that the Lord struck down the Cushites before Asa and Judah. The invading army was routed so completely that they could not recover. Judah pursued them and carried off plunder in quantities so vast it took days to collect. They struck down all the surrounding villages, and the fear of the Lord came upon them. This victory established Asa as a king who trusted God, a leader who understood that human strength was insufficient against overwhelming odds. The nation rallied around this narrative. Songs were written about the defeat of Zerah. The temple received generous offerings from the plunder. Asa's reputation as a faithful king spread to neighbouring kingdoms. Everything in his early reign pointed toward a legacy of unwavering trust in divine providence. The kingdom flourished in the aftermath. Trade routes stabilized. Agricultural production increased. The population grew. Jerusalem became more prominent as a religious and political center. Asa continued building projects, strengthening defenses, and organizing the administration of justice throughout Judah. By every measurable standard, his kingship was succeeding. The reforms had worked. The faith had been vindicated. God had proven faithful. But success has a way of reshaping our understanding of why success occurred. When decades pass between the moment of desperate prayer and the next serious crisis, Memory becomes selective. The vivid desperation fades. The overwhelming gratitude softens into comfortable assumption. We begin to believe that our careful planning, our wise administration, our strategic thinking played a larger role than perhaps they did. We forget the prayer that acknowledged powerlessness, and remember instead the victory that proved our strength. Asa ruled in this space of established success for years. The kingdom he governed was stable, prosperous, and secure. His early decisions had created conditions for lasting peace. His spiritual leadership had unified the nation around covenant faithfulness. By the time 35 years of his reign had passed, it would have been easy to believe that Judah's strength was self-sustaining, that the foundation he had built was sufficient to handle whatever challenges might emerge. The reforms were complete, the systems were working, the threats had been neutralized. But faith is not a foundation we build once and walk away from. It is a relationship we maintain daily, a posture we must continually renew, a dependence we either acknowledge or slowly forget. And in the 36th year of Asa's reign, that reality would be tested in a way that revealed how much had changed since the day he faced Zerah's army and cried out to God in desperate faith. Chapter 2. A new threat emerges. The messenger arrived in Jerusalem with news that shifted the political landscape of the entire region. Baasha, king of Israel, had begun fortifying Ramah, a strategic location, just a few miles north of Jerusalem. To understand the significance, you have to grasp the geography. Ramah sat at a critical junction controlling the main road between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. By fortifying this location, Baasha was effectively establishing a military checkpoint that could control trade, monitor movement, and project power directly toward Jerusalem itself. This wasn't an invasion in the traditional sense. No armies had crossed borders, no battles had been fought. But it was absolutely a hostile act, a strategic move designed to constrain Judah's options and assert Israel's dominance in the region. The fortification of Ramah would prevent anyone from leaving or entering Judah freely. It would disrupt the economic stability Asa had spent decades building. It would make Jerusalem vulnerable to northern aggression in ways that undermined all the defensive preparations Asa had carefully constructed. The situation was serious, but it wasn't hopeless. Judah had resources, the kingdom was stable, the military was well organized, and more importantly, Judah had a history of divine deliverance that dwarfed the current challenge. Asa had faced far worse odds against Zerah's massive invasion force. Compared to that overwhelming threat, Baasha's fortification project was manageable. A king who had once prayed for help against hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers and 300 chariots could surely trust God to handle a construction project in Ramah. But something had changed in Asa during those 35 years of peace and prosperity. The king who once called out to God in desperate dependence now assessed the situation through a different lens. He looked at the problem and saw not an opportunity to trust God again, but a political challenge requiring a political solution. He considered his options with the calculating eye of an experienced administrator rather than the faith-filled heart of a desperate supplicant. Asa turned his attention north, but not toward God. He looked toward Damascus, toward Ben-Hadad, king of Aram. Here was a powerful regional player with his own interests in keeping Israel from becoming too strong. Here was a potential ally with military resources that could pressure Israel from the north, while Judah responded from the south. Here was a practical solution that made perfect strategic sense by the logic of international politics. The plan was straightforward. Asa would send gifts to Ben-Hadad, treasures that would make an alliance attractive. He would appeal to their existing diplomatic relationship and propose a new agreement. If Ben-Hadad attacked Israel from the north, Baasha would be forced to abandon the Ramah project to defend his own territory. The threat would be neutralized without Judah risking a direct military confrontation. It was, by conventional wisdom, a smart move. But there was a problem with the plan, one that Asa either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. The treasures he would send to Ben-Hadad weren't just state assets. They were sacred resources, gifts that had been dedicated to God, stored in the temple treasury and the palace treasuries specifically because they represented the covenant relationship between Judah and the Lord. Using these resources to buy a military alliance was more than just a political maneuver. It was a theological statement, a declaration that the treasures dedicated to God could be repurposed for human schemes when circumstances required it. Asa gathered silver and gold from the temple treasuries and from his own palace treasuries. The amounts were substantial, enough to make Ben-Hadad take notice, enough to shift the balance of regional power. He sent them north with a message carefully crafted to appeal to Ben-Hadad's interests. "Let there be a treaty between me and you, as there was between my father and your father. See, I am sending you silver and gold. Now break your treaty with Baasha, king of Israel, so he will withdraw from me." The message revealed Asa's thinking. He wasn't approaching this as a matter requiring divine guidance. He was conducting international diplomacy according to the standard practices of ancient Near Eastern politics. You identify shared interests, offer valuable inducements, and construct agreements that benefit both parties. You leverage existing relationships and create new obligations. You use resources strategically to achieve political objectives. It was all very reasonable, very pragmatic, very much in line with how experienced rulers operated. Ben-Hadad agreed to Asa's proposal. The treasures were persuasive, and the strategic logic was sound. He sent his army commanders against the towns of Israel. They conquered several significant locations, capturing territory and disrupting Israel's northern defences. The news reached Baasha quickly, and as Asa had predicted, the king of Israel was forced to respond. He stopped building Ramah and withdrew his forces to deal with the more immediate threat from Aram. The plan worked. By every conventional measure, Asa's strategy had succeeded. The threat to Jerusalem was neutralised. The fortification of Ramah was abandoned. Asa even took the materials Baasha had been using to build up Ramah and used them to fortify Geba and Mizpah, turning his enemy's resources into his own defensive advantage. The kingdom remained secure. Trade routes stayed open. The crisis passed without Judah suffering any military casualties. In the royal court, Asa's advisors likely praised his wisdom. The political establishment probably viewed it as masterful diplomacy. The people of Jerusalem, unaware of the deeper theological implications, simply felt relieved that the threat had passed without war coming to their doorstep. By the metrics that typically measure royal success, Asa had performed brilliantly. He had identified a problem, formulated a solution, and executed it effectively. The king who had once reformed Judah's spiritual life had now demonstrated equal skill in managing its political challenges. But there was a perspective missing from all these calculations, a voice that would speak uncomfortable truth about what had actually happened. Because while Asa had solved the immediate political problem, he had revealed something far more troubling about the trajectory of his faith. The king who once declared, "Lord, there is no one like you to help the powerless against the mighty," had just demonstrated that he no longer saw himself as powerless. The leader who once relied entirely on God had just bet the temple treasury on a foreign alliance. The man who had taught his nation to trust divine providence above human strength had just written a different lesson entirely, and someone was about to point that out. Chapter 3. The Prophet Speaks. Hanani was not a prominent figure in the royal court. He wasn't one of the advisors who surrounded Asa daily, offering counsel on political matters and military strategy. He wasn't part of the administrative structure that managed the kingdom's affairs. He was a seer, someone who saw things others missed, who perceived spiritual realities beneath political surfaces, who understood that the visible outcomes of human decisions were only part of the story being written. The scriptures give us almost nothing about Hanani's background. We don't know his age, his family connections, or how long he had served as a prophet. We know only that when God needed someone to speak truth to a king who had stopped listening for divine guidance, Hanani was the one called, and he approached Asa not with dramatic thunder or supernatural signs, but with the quiet authority of someone delivering a message he didn't author, but was responsible for communicating. The meeting probably took place in one of the private chambers of the palace, away from the court officials and military commanders who might have defended Asa's strategy. There was no public spectacle, no crowd gathered to witness a prophetic confrontation, just a king who thought he had handled a crisis well, and a prophet who saw it very differently. Hanani's opening words cut through any pleasantries. Because you relied on the king of Aram and not on the Lord your God, the army of the king of Aram has escaped from your hand. It was a simple observation, but it reframed everything. Asa thought he had neutralized a threat and strengthened Judah's position. Hanani pointed out what Asa had actually done. He had enabled an enemy to grow stronger while demonstrating that Judah no longer trusted God to handle its problems. The immediate crisis with Baasha was resolved, but a larger strategic opportunity had been missed. If Asa had trusted God as he once had, both Baasha's forces and Ben-Hadad's army might have been defeated. Instead, Asa's alliance had simply shifted regional power without actually securing lasting peace. But Hanani wasn't finished. He needed Asa to remember what he seemed to have forgotten. Were not the Cushites and Libyans a mighty army with great numbers of chariots and horsemen? Yet when you relied on the Lord, he delivered them into your hand. This was the heart of the message. Hanani forced Asa to compare two moments in his reign. The first, facing an overwhelming invasion with nothing but desperate faith and a prayer acknowledging powerlessness. The second, facing a fortification project with carefully calculated diplomacy and temple treasures. The first crisis was objectively more dangerous. The second crisis was objectively more manageable. Yet Asa trusted God for the first and trusted human alliances for the second. What had changed? Not the nature of the threat, not God's ability to deliver. What had changed was Asa himself. Success, stability, and years of peace had gradually shifted his understanding of where security actually came from. The king who once knew he was powerless against a mighty army now believed he was powerful enough to solve his own problems. The man who once cried out to God had learned to rely on his own wisdom and resources. Hanani then delivered the theological principle behind his critique, words that would echo far beyond this single conversation. For the eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. This wasn't about God being angry or vindictive. It was about how divine providence actually works. God actively looks for people whose trust is complete, whose dependence is genuine, whose faith doesn't waver when circumstances stabilize. And when God finds such people, he strengthens them, not because they're perfect, but because their hearts are positioned to receive his help. Asa had removed himself from that category, not by committing some horrible sin, but by becoming self-sufficient in his thinking, by trusting human wisdom over divine faithfulness. The conclusion of Hanani's message was, painful but necessary. You have done a foolish thing, and from now on you will be at war. The word foolish stung. Asa's advisors had probably called his strategy wise. His court had likely praised his diplomatic skill. But from God's perspective, turning away from the one who had delivered Judah from impossible odds to trust a foreign king with temple treasures was foolishness of the deepest kind. It wasn't stupidity. Asa was clearly intelligent. It was the specific kind of folly that comes from trusting created things over the Creator, from believing that human schemes could provide better security than divine faithfulness. And the consequence wasn't divine punishment in the sense of God actively harming Judah. It was the natural result of the choice Asa had made. By demonstrating that Judah would solve its problems through human alliances rather than trust in God, Asa had ensured that Judah would continue facing problems that required constant human maneuvering. The peace that comes from resting in God's provision was replaced with the ongoing anxiety of maintaining political alliances and managing regional powers. From now on there would be wars, not because God ordained them as punishment, but because Asa had chosen to operate in the realm of human conflict rather than divine peace. The message was firm but not cruel. Hanani wasn't condemning Asa's character or declaring him abandoned by God. He was simply holding up a mirror and asking the king to see what he had become. The man who once led Judah back to covenant faithfulness had himself drifted from the very dependence he had once modelled. The reformer needed reform. The leader needed correction. It was the kind of prophetic word designed not to destroy but to restore, not to condemn but to redirect. Hanani had come to give Asa the opportunity to recognize his drift, and return to the faith that had once defined his kingship. All Asa had to do was listen, acknowledge the truth of what Hanani was saying, and choose dependence over self-reliance once more. But that's not what happened. Chapter 4. The uncomfortable truth. When prophetic correction lands in the heart of a humble person, it produces repentance. When it lands in the heart of a proud person, it produces rage. Hanani's words weren't harsh by prophetic standards. There were no pronouncements of destruction, no declarations of exile, no dramatic judgments. The message was actually quite measured. You relied on human help instead of a God, and as a result you'll continue dealing with human conflicts instead of experiencing divine peace. It was an observation about consequences, not a vengeful curse. But Asa heard something different. He heard an attack on his wisdom. He heard a challenge to his authority. He heard someone suggesting that his carefully considered strategy was actually foolish, that his diplomatic success was actually a failure, that his leadership had drifted from the foundation that once made it effective. And instead of pausing to consider whether Hanani might be right, Asa reacted with the defensive anger of someone whose self-image has been threatened. The king's response was swift and severe. He had Hanani put in prison, locked in stocks specifically, a form of detention designed to be not just restrictive but painful. This wasn't a gentle house arrest or a temporary holding cell. It was punitive imprisonment intended to punish the prophet for speaking uncomfortable truth. The man who brought God's word to the king was treated like a criminal for the crime of challenging royal decisions. The scriptures record that Asa was enraged with Hanani because of this. The Hebrew word suggests intense fury, the kind of anger that overwhelms judgment and produces impulsive cruelty. It wasn't merely that Asa disagreed with Hanani's assessment. He was infuriated that someone dared to question him at all. The king, who had once listened to spiritual counsel and acted on it, had become the kind of leader who punished anyone who challenged his choices. And it didn't stop with Hanani. The text tells us that at the same time, Asa brutally oppressed some of the people. The prophet's imprisonment created a climate of fear that extended beyond one individual. Others in the kingdom, perhaps those who had voiced agreement with Hanani, or simply failed to praise Asa's handling of the Baasha crisis enthusiastically enough, found themselves facing harsh treatment. The king who had once unified Judah through spiritual renewal was now ruling through intimidation. This is what makes Asa's story particularly tragic. He didn't become a tyrant overnight. There was no sudden transformation from faithful king to brutal dictator. Instead, there was a gradual drift, a slow erosion of the humility that had once characterized his leadership. Success had replaced dependence. Confidence had replaced trust. And when those shifts were pointed out by a prophet, pride prevented Asa from seeing what had happened to him. Think about the psychology of what occurred. Asa had spent decades building a successful kingdom. His reforms had worked. His leadership had brought prosperity. His careful administration had created stability. Every advisor around him likely confirmed that he was doing well. The people lived in peace. The enemies had been neutralized. By every visible measure, his kingship was succeeding. And then Hanani showed up and said, essentially, "You've forgotten what made you successful in the first place. You're trusting the wrong things." That's almost impossible for a powerful person to hear. When your entire identity is wrapped up in your competence, when your legacy is defined by your accomplishments, when your authority rests on your ability to make good decisions, having someone challenge the foundation of your thinking feels like an existential threat. Asa couldn't receive Hanani's correction without dismantling his entire self-understanding. He couldn't acknowledge that his diplomatic success was actually spiritual failure without questioning everything he had built. So he chose defense over introspection. He chose anger over humility. He chose to silence the messenger rather than examine the message. And in doing so, he confirmed everything Hanani had said about the state of his heart. A king whose heart was fully committed to God would have paused, prayed, and considered whether the prophet might be right. A king who had drifted from that posture of dependence reacted with rage and repression. The tragedy deepened because Asa had the scriptural and experiential knowledge to know better. He had lived through the moment when he cried out to God against Zerah's army. He remembered the overwhelming relief when God delivered Judah from impossible odds. He had personally experienced the peace that comes from trusting God completely. But that memory had faded into the background of his consciousness, replaced by more recent memories of his own successful decision-making. The vivid experience of divine deliverance had been covered over by decades of human competence. This is the danger that success poses to faith. When things are going well, when our decisions seem to produce positive outcomes, when stability becomes normal, we gradually begin to believe that we are the source of our own security. The desperation that drove us to God in crisis fades. The awareness of our limitations diminishes. The gratitude that once overflowed becomes perfunctory. We don't consciously decide to stop trusting God. We simply develop parallel trust in our own wisdom and capabilities until, eventually, that becomes our primary reliance. And when someone points out this drift, we have a choice. We can receive it as the gift of correction, an opportunity to return to the foundation that once sustained us. Or we can reject it as an insult to our competence, a challenge to our authority that must be suppressed. Asa chose the second path, and in choosing it, he set the trajectory for the remainder of his reign. The imprisoned prophet sat in stocks, physically suffering for telling the truth. The oppressed citizens of Judah lived under increased fear, wondering if they might be next. And Asa continued ruling with the outward appearance of strength, while inwardly becoming more brittle, more defensive, more isolated from the very sources of wisdom that had once made him great. The man who had once removed idols from Judah had created a new idol, his own judgment, and he would defend that idol with whatever force necessary. Chapter 5. A King's Pride. The years following Hanani's imprisonment revealed the full extent of Asa's transformation. Where once he had been a reformer willing to challenge the status quo for the sake of faithfulness, he became a defender of his own decisions regardless of their spiritual implications. Where once he had sought God's guidance in times of crisis, he now relied exclusively on human wisdom and resources. The foundation had shifted, and the structure built upon it began to show cracks. The wars Hanani predicted materialized, not as dramatic invasions, but as the constant low-level conflicts that characterize kingdoms, trusting in political maneuvering rather than divine peace. Judah remained stable enough to avoid catastrophe, but the rest Asa had once known, the peace that came from seeking God wholeheartedly, was gone. In its place was the grinding work of maintaining alliances, managing regional tensions, and responding to threats through diplomatic and military means. But the most telling moment of Asa's later reign came not in war but in illness. In the 39th year of his rule, 3 years after imprisoning Hanani, Asa developed a disease in his feet. The condition was severe, debilitating enough that the chroniclers made specific note of it. Medical historians have speculated about what this might have been, gangrene perhaps, or some form of severe infection, or complications from gout. Whatever the specific diagnosis, it was serious enough to threaten Asa's life, and painful enough to dominate his final years. And here, in this moment of physical crisis, the pattern of Asa's spiritual drift reached its tragic conclusion. The text records with devastating simplicity. Though his disease was severe, even in his illness he did not seek help from the Lord, but only from the physicians. This single sentence captures everything about what Asa had become. It wasn't that seeking help from physicians was wrong. God has given human beings wisdom and skill in medicine, and there's nothing spiritually compromised about receiving medical treatment. But the word only reveals Asa's posture. He turned to human help exclusively, without any acknowledgement that God might be involved in healing, without any prayer for divine intervention, without any recognition that the great physician might have purposes beyond what human medicine could address. It was the same pattern that had characterized his response to Baasha's threat. When faced with a challenge, Asa looked to human solutions without considering divine options. When confronted with his own limitations, he trusted created things rather than the Creator. The man who once prayed, "Lord, there is no one like you to help the powerless against the mighty," now approached his own powerlessness without any thought of calling on that same Lord. The physicians did what they could, Ancient medicine had its limitations, lacking the antibiotics, surgical techniques and diagnostic tools that modern healthcare provides. They would have applied poultices, recommended dietary changes, perhaps attempted procedures that we would recognise as primitive. But they couldn't heal Asa. Whatever was wrong with his feet continued to worsen, and the king, who had once stood strong before armies, found himself increasingly unable to even stand physically. The chroniclers don't record whether Asa ever reflected on Hanani's words during those painful final years. We don't know if the king, lying in bed with diseased feet, ever thought about the prophet sitting in prison for telling him the truth. We don't know if he connected his physical suffering with his spiritual drift, if he saw his deteriorating health as an image of his deteriorating faith. The text simply records the facts: severe disease, no seeking of God, reliance only on physicians, and eventual death in the 41st year of his reign. Asa died without any recorded reconciliation with Hanani. There's no mention of the prophet being released from prison. There's no account of Asa repenting of his pride and returning to the posture of dependence that had once defined his early reign. The man who began so well, who reformed a nation and trusted God for impossible victory, ended his life having imprisoned the last prophet who dared to challenge his self-sufficiency. The funeral was elaborate. They laid Asa in a tomb he had cut out for himself in the city of David. They placed him on a bier covered with spices and various blended perfumes. They made a huge fire in his honour. The outward ceremonies celebrated a long reign and acknowledged his contributions to Judah's stability. But beneath the public honours was the private reality of a king who had forgotten where his true strength came from. His son Jehoshaphat succeeded him, and the chroniclers record that Jehoshaphat walked in the ways his father Asa had followed in his early years. Even Asa's own son recognised that there were two versions of King Asa, the faithful reformer of the beginning and the proud, defensive ruler of the end. The legacy was split, the reign remembered as both example and warning. Think about what might have been different if Asa had received Hanani's correction with humility. If instead of imprisoning the prophet he had listened, if instead of continuing in self-reliance he had returned to the faith that had once sustained him, if instead of trusting only in physicians during his illness, he had combined medical care with desperate prayer to the God who had once delivered him from Zerah's army. The trajectory of his final years could have been completely different, not necessarily in physical outcome, but certainly in spiritual legacy. But pride prevented that alternative story. Pride made correction feel like attack. Pride turned challenge into threat. Pride convinced Asa that defending his decisions mattered more than examining whether those decisions aligned with covenant faithfulness. And pride, in the end, left him isolated from both the human counsel that might have helped and the divine relationship that had once been his foundation. The man who had once told Judah to seek the Lord died without seeking the Lord himself. The king who had once relied on God for victory against overwhelming odds died relying exclusively on human help for healing. The leader who had reformed an entire nation's spiritual life died unreformed in his own heart. It was a tragedy not of sudden catastrophe, but of gradual drift, not of dramatic failure, but of quiet pride, not of external defeat, but of internal compromise. Chapter 6. Consequences over time. The story of Asa forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of spiritual decline. We tend to think of falling away from faith as dramatic, as involving clear moral failures or explicit rejection of God. But Asa's drift was far more subtle. He never renounced the God of Israel. He never restored the idols he had removed. He never led Judah back into the pagan practices he had worked so hard to eliminate. By many measures, he remained a relatively faithful king throughout his reign. Yet something essential had changed. The posture of his heart had shifted from dependence to self-reliance. The orientation of his trust had moved from divine faithfulness to human wisdom. The source of his security had transferred from God's provision to his own competence. These internal shifts didn't produce immediate external consequences. Judah remained stable. The kingdom continued functioning. But underneath the surface, the foundation was slowly eroding. This is perhaps the most dangerous kind of spiritual decline because it's so easy to miss. When life is going well, when decisions are producing positive results, when stability feels secure, we don't recognise that our trust has migrated from God to our own capabilities. We still pray, still participate in worship, still affirm our faith, but the deep dependence that once characterised our relationship with God has been replaced by comfortable religious routine alongside practical self-sufficiency. Asa's later reign demonstrates how this plays out over time. The wars Hanani predicted weren't apocalyptic battles threatening Judah's existence. They were ongoing conflicts requiring constant attention, diplomatic manoeuvring, and military readiness. Judah never collapsed, but it never returned to the rest that characterised Asa's early years either. Life became an endless management of regional tensions rather than a stable peace rooted in trust. The human cost of Asa's pride extended beyond his own spiritual condition. Hanani, imprisoned for speaking truth, represented every voice of correction that gets silenced when leaders value their authority over their accountability. The people Asa oppressed represented every person who suffers when power becomes more concerned with preserving itself than serving righteously. The son who succeeded him, Jehoshaphat, had to navigate the complex legacy of a father who was both example and warning. Yet even in this tragic trajectory, there's something important to note. Asa wasn't erased from redemptive history. His early faithfulness still mattered. His reforms still had lasting impact. The removal of idols and restoration of worship didn't become meaningless because of his later failures. God's work, through him in those early years, remained real and significant. The story of Asa isn't that one set of failures negates a lifetime of faithfulness. It's that a lifetime of faithfulness can still end badly if we stop renewing the posture that made that faithfulness possible. The chroniclers recorded Asa's reign with neither complete condemnation nor unqualified praise. They acknowledged his strengths and documented his failures. They celebrated his early faithfulness and lamented his later pride. They preserved his story not to destroy his legacy, but to teach future generations about the ongoing nature of faith, about the danger of resting on past spiritual victories, about the necessity of continual dependence regardless of how stable life appears. The contrast between young Asa facing Zerah and old Asa facing illness crystallizes the entire narrative. The young king, overwhelmed by impossible odds, cried out to God in complete dependence. The old king, overwhelmed by disease, sought only human help. Both moments involved genuine powerlessness. Both situations exceeded Asa's ability to solve through his own strength. But in one, he recognized his limitations and turned to God. In the other, he trusted only in human capabilities despite having experienced divine deliverance decades earlier. What happened between those two moments? Success, stability, and the gradual accumulation of confidence in his own wisdom. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden, just the slow drift that comes when we stop actively renewing our dependence on God. The memory of crying out in desperate faith faded, replaced by more recent memories of competent leadership and wise decision-making. The experiential knowledge of divine deliverance was covered over by decades of self-sufficient problem-solving. And when Hanani tried to point out this drift, to remind Asa of what he had forgotten, the king's response confirmed how far he had travelled from the humility of his early years. Instead of pausing to consider whether the prophet might be right, he reacted with defensive rage. Instead of examining his own heart, he imprisoned the messenger. Instead of using the correction as an opportunity to return to dependence, he doubled down on self-reliance. The physicians Asa consulted in his final illness likely did their best. They applied whatever knowledge and skill they possessed. They made recommendations and attempted treatments. But they couldn't address the deeper issue, the spiritual condition that left Asa seeking help exclusively from human sources without any acknowledgement of divine involvement. They could treat symptoms but not the root cause, a heart that had slowly turned away from the God who once delivered Judah from impossible odds. Asa died without any recorded moment of recognition, without any documented return to the faith of his early years, without any acknowledgement that Hanani had been right. The king who once led a nation back to covenant faithfulness couldn't quite make that journey himself when it mattered most, And so his story ends not with restoration but with warning, not with redemption but with the tragic consequences of pride unaddressed and correction rejected. Chapter 7. A Life Remembered. The legacy of Asa presents a complex picture that resists simple categorization. He wasn't a completely faithful king who made one terrible mistake, nor was he a secretly corrupt ruler whose early reforms were merely political theatre. He was something more recognizably human, a leader who began with genuine faith, achieved significant success through that faith, and then slowly came to trust his own wisdom more than the divine faithfulness that had initially sustained him. The biblical chroniclers preserved his story with remarkable honesty. They didn't sanitize his later failures to protect his reputation. They didn't exaggerate his early faithfulness to make the contrast more dramatic. They simply recorded both phases of his reign and allowed readers to draw their own conclusions about what happens when dependence gives way to self-reliance. In the genealogies of Judah's kings, Asa occupies an important place. He was the king who reversed the spiritual decline initiated by his predecessors. He removed the idols that had corrupted worship. He restored the covenant practices that defined Israel's relationship with God. He taught an entire generation what faithfulness looked like in practical terms, removing what shouldn't be there, rebuilding what had been neglected, and trusting God when circumstances seemed overwhelming. These contributions didn't evaporate because of his later pride. The idols he removed stayed gone. The worship practices he restored continued after his death. The spiritual foundation he rebuilt provided stability for his son's reign. God worked through Asa in those early years in ways that had lasting impact on Judah's history. The reforms were real, the faith was genuine, and the results were significant. But the ending of his story serves as a perpetual warning that beginning well doesn't guarantee finishing well, that early faithfulness doesn't exempt us from the ongoing work of maintaining dependence on God. That success can be more dangerous to faith than failure, because it convinces us we're strong enough to handle things on our own. That the test of our trust often comes not in crisis, but in comfort. Not when we're desperate, but when we're confident. Subsequent generations in Judah would have known Asa's story in both its triumph and its tragedy. When they gathered for worship in the temple, they would remember that Asa had restored proper worship practices. When they saw the fortified cities throughout the kingdom, they would remember that Asa had built them during a time of peace secured through trusting God. When they recalled the defeat of Zerah's massive army, they would remember Asa's prayer acknowledging that only God could help the powerless against the mighty. But they would also remember Hanani. They would remember the prophet who spoke truth to power and suffered for it. They would remember the king who couldn't receive correction without rage. They would remember the lesson that imprisoning truth doesn't change truth, that silencing prophets doesn't validate the decisions they challenged, that defending our choices through force reveals the weakness of our position rather than its strength. The account of Asa appears in both 2 Chronicles and 1 Kings, with slight variations in emphasis but consistent in the basic narrative. Both accounts acknowledge his early faithfulness and document his later failures. Both record his successful military victory against Zerah and his problematic alliance with Ben-Hadad. Both note his reform efforts and his imprisonment of Hanani. The dual preservation of his story in Scripture suggests its importance as a teaching tool for understanding the ongoing nature of faith. For the people of Judah living under subsequent kings, Asa's reign provided categories for evaluating leadership. A king could be assessed not just by his policies, but by his posture toward God. The question wasn't merely whether idols were removed or enemies defeated, but whether the king maintained the posture of dependence that recognized God as the true source of security. A leader who began well but ended poorly taught something just as important as a leader who remained faithful throughout, that faith requires continual renewal, that trust must be consciously maintained, that dependence doesn't become automatic just because we once experienced it deeply. The chronicler's treatment of Asa also revealed something important about biblical historiography. They weren't engaged in propaganda designed to make every faithful king look perfect, or every unfaithful king look completely evil. They recorded reality with its complexities and contradictions, allowing human beings to appear human, acknowledging that the same person can make both wise and foolish decisions, can act from both faith and pride, can lead with both humility and arrogance depending on the circumstances and the condition of their heart. This honest accounting serves readers across millennia by validating our own complex experiences of faith. We don't have to pretend that spiritual life is simple or linear. We don't have to hide our struggles with pride or minimize our failures to trust God. We can acknowledge that faithfulness in one season doesn't guarantee faithfulness in the next, that we need God's grace not just at conversion, but continually, that the work of maintaining dependence is never complete while we live in this world. Asa's story also functions as a warning against the particular temptation of religious leaders and mature believers. People who have experienced significant spiritual victories, who have led others to faith, who have contributed to God's work in substantial ways face a unique danger. The very success of their faithfulness can become a source of pride that gradually replaces the dependence that made that faithfulness possible. The recognition of their spiritual maturity can convince them they've graduated beyond the need for correction. The respect of others can insulate them from the truth about their own hearts. When Hanani approached Asa, he wasn't confronting a flagrant sinner or an obvious hypocrite. He was addressing a king with a mostly successful reign, who had simply stopped trusting God as completely as he once had. The subtlety of Asa's drift is what makes the story so relevant. Most spiritual decline doesn't involve dramatic moral failures or explicit rejection of faith. It involves the gradual shift from "I need God desperately" to "I've got this figured out," that comes so naturally when life stabilizes and our competence increases. The lack of any recorded restoration in Asa's story leaves readers with an unsettling question. Could it have been different? If Asa had received Hanani's correction with humility, if he had recognized the truth in the prophet's words, if he had returned to the posture of dependence that characterized his early reign, would his final years have unfolded differently? We can't know for certain, but the question itself is important because it reminds us that we still have the opportunity to choose differently in our own lives. When correction comes, when someone points out that we've drifted from dependence to self-reliance, we can choose humility over pride, introspection over defense, return over resistance. Asa's life remembered is ultimately a call to vigilance, not the anxious vigilance that questions every decision or the scrupulous vigilance that becomes paralyzed by fear of failure, but the honest vigilance that regularly asks, where am I actually trusting? What am I really depending on? Has my success convinced me I'm strong enough to handle life without God's constant provision? Have I stopped crying out in prayer because I've become confident in my own wisdom? Do I react defensively when someone suggests I might be drifting? These questions matter because the trajectory of faith isn't determined by a single moment, but by the cumulative effect of thousands of small choices about where we place our trust. Asa made good choices early and poor choices late, not because he changed religions or abandoned morality, but because he slowly stopped choosing dependence over self-reliance. His story stands as evidence that the work of faith is never done, that trust must be renewed continually, that the posture of our hearts requires constant attention, regardless of how long we've walked with God or how much we've accomplished in his service. Epilogue: Eyes that search the earth. Hanani's words to Asa have echoed across centuries. The eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. It's one of those biblical statements that sounds comforting at first but becomes more challenging the longer you sit with it. God isn't primarily looking for talented people, though he can use talent. He isn't primarily looking for competent people, though competence has its place. He isn't primarily looking for successful people, though success rightly understood is fine. God is looking for people whose hearts are fully committed to him, people who maintain the posture of dependence regardless of their circumstances, people who trust him in prosperity as completely as they trusted him in desperation. This isn't about perfection. Asa's early reign wasn't flawless. He made mistakes, faced challenges, navigated complex situations. But his heart was oriented toward God, and that orientation made all the difference. When overwhelming odds threatened Judah, Asa's response revealed where his trust actually resided. "Lord, there is no one like you to help the powerless against the mighty." That's the kind of heart God searches for and strengthens. The tragedy of Asa's story is that he once had exactly this kind of heart. He experienced God's strengthening in dramatic fashion. He knew what it meant to trust completely and see God prove faithful. But that experiential knowledge gradually faded into the background as years passed and success accumulated. The heart that was once fully committed became partially committed, divided between trusting God and trusting human resources, split between dependence and self-reliance. And when that division was pointed out by Hanani, when Asa had the opportunity to recognize his drift and return to full commitment, pride prevented it. The king whose heart God had once strengthened became the king whose heart resisted correction. The leader who had taught others to trust God became the example of what happens when trust erodes over time. But the principle Hanani articulated remains true, regardless of Asa's failure to live it out. God's eyes still range throughout the earth. He still searches for hearts fully committed to him. He still strengthens those who maintain the posture of dependence. The failure of one king doesn't invalidate the spiritual reality. If anything, Asa's story makes the principle more urgent by showing what's at stake when we drift from it. Consider what full commitment actually means in practical terms. It doesn't mean never using human wisdom or resources. Asa wasn't wrong to fortify cities or organise the military. It doesn't mean being passive or inactive. Asa's reforms required tremendous effort and courage. It doesn't mean pretending we don't have capabilities or gifts. Asa was clearly an intelligent and capable leader. Full commitment means that underneath all our planning, strategizing and effort, our fundamental trust rests in God rather than in ourselves. It means that when we face challenges exceeding our natural abilities, our first response is to seek divine help rather than exclusively pursuing human solutions. It means that when we achieve success, we recognize God's provision rather than crediting only our own competence. It means that when someone points out we're drifting from this posture, we receive it as correction rather than attack. Asa's early prayer against Zerah perfectly captured this balance. He didn't pray instead of organizing his army. He organized his army and prayed. He didn't deny that military strategy mattered. He acknowledged that no strategy could overcome the odds without divine intervention. He combined human responsibility with divine dependence in a way that honoured both. That's what full commitment looks like in action. The contrast with his later response to Baasha's threat couldn't be sharper. When faced with a less overwhelming challenge, Asa relied entirely on human diplomacy without seeking God at all. He used resources dedicated to God to buy a military alliance without praying about whether this aligned with divine purposes. He solved the immediate problem while creating long-term consequences. That's what partial commitment looks like, effective in the short term, but disconnected from the source of lasting peace. For those of us reading Asa's story millennia later, the application is uncomfortably direct. We live in an era that celebrates self-reliance and prizes competence. We're taught to trust data, to make strategic plans, to leverage resources effectively. These aren't wrong in themselves, but they become dangerous when they replace rather than supplement dependence on God. When our first instinct in crisis is to Google solutions rather than pray. When our security rests in savings accounts rather than divine provision. When our confidence comes from our abilities rather than God's faithfulness. The challenge is that this drift happens so gradually we don't notice it. We don't consciously decide to stop trusting God. We just slowly develop parallel trust in our own capabilities until that becomes primary. We still pray, still attend, worship, still affirm our faith. But the desperate dependence that once characterized our relationship with God has been replaced by comfortable religious routine alongside practical self-sufficiency. We become functional atheists who maintain religious language but operate as if outcomes depend entirely on us. Hanani's confrontation of Asa offers a template for how to address this drift, both in our own lives and when we see it in others. The prophet didn't attack Asa's character or question his faith. He simply reminded the king of what he already knew, that he once trusted God completely and God proved faithful. He held up the past as a mirror to examine the present. He asked, essentially, what changed? not God's ability to deliver. So what changed in you? That's the question we all need to sit with regularly. What has changed in me? When did I stop crying out to God in prayer and start relying primarily on my own wisdom? When did success convince me I was strong enough to handle things independently? When did stability lead me to forget how desperately I need divine provision? These aren't comfortable questions, but they're necessary for maintaining the kind of full commitment God searches for. The ongoing nature of this work can't be overstated. Faith isn't proven once and then finished. Trust isn't established in one dramatic moment and then maintained automatically. Dependence doesn't become our default setting just because we experienced it deeply in the past. The posture of our hearts requires continual attention, regular examination, and frequent renewal. We can't coast on yesterday's faithfulness. We can't rely on past spiritual victories to sustain present trust. We have to choose dependence repeatedly, in circumstances big and small, throughout all the seasons of our lives. Asa's story ends with his death and burial, but the principles it teaches continue to live. Somewhere in Judah, after his death, another person faced a crisis and had to decide whether to trust God or human solutions. Another leader navigated the tension between competent planning and desperate prayer. Another believer wrestled with the slow drift from dependence to self-reliance. Asa's story informed those decisions by providing both example and warning, both inspiration and caution. And the same remains true today. The eyes of the Lord still range throughout the earth. God still searches for hearts fully committed to him. He still strengthens those who maintain dependence regardless of their circumstances. The question isn't whether this principle works, but whether we'll live in alignment with it. Whether we'll be like young Asa crying out in faith, or old Asa trusting only in human help. Whether we'll receive correction with humility or reject it with pride. Whether we'll finish our lives with hearts fully committed, or with the tragic division that comes from gradual drift. The God who delivered Judah from Zerah's overwhelming army hasn't changed. The divine faithfulness that sustained Asa's early reign remains constant. The offer of strength for those whose hearts are fully committed still stands. What changes is us, our trust, our dependence, our willingness to acknowledge that we desperately need God regardless of how capable we've become or how stable our circumstances appear. Hanani delivered his message and faced imprisonment. Asa rejected correction and faced ongoing conflict. But the truth Hanani spoke didn't depend on Asa's reception. God's eyes still range throughout the earth. And tonight, right now, wherever you are in your own journey of faith, that same God is searching for hearts fully committed to him, ready to strengthen anyone willing to maintain the posture of trust that Asa once knew, but ultimately abandoned. The story doesn't end with answers to every question. We don't know what finally happened to Hanani. We don't know if Asa ever regretted his response. We don't know how different his final years might have been if he had chosen humility over pride. But we do know this. Faith must be renewed continually. Trust can't rest on past victories. Dependence requires ongoing choice. And the God who once strengthened a king, who cried out in desperate faith, still searches for hearts positioned to receive that same strengthening today. That's the legacy of Asa's mixed reign. The warning from his later failures, the hope from his early faithfulness, and the ongoing invitation embedded in Hanani's words. The eyes of the Lord are still searching. The question is whether our hearts remain fully committed or whether, like Asa, we've slowly drifted into trusting our own strength while maintaining the language of faith. It's a question worth sitting with, because how we answer it shapes not just our immediate circumstances, but the entire trajectory of our lives and the legacy we leave behind.